Well, as the kids say, she mudflood on my pyramids until I Irish wisdom. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Line. Everyone loves a good conspiracy theory. In an era where access to information on just about everything is available at the touch of a screen, there's something about the idea that everything isn't what it seems that just digs its way into our minds and refuses to let go. Whether they be strange tales of disappearing naval vessels, questions about the shape of our planet, or reimaginations of religious texts, these theories have been part of modern life for as long as anyone can really recall. And the rise of the internet has really thrown them into overdrive. What used to be relegated to minimally published books and magazines now appears on the front page of your favorite social media site. Conversations which once existed only in email chains and far-flung corners of the web have become commonplace topics of discussion. And on this channel, we've covered quite a few of them. There's Chan Thomas's Adam and Eve theory, there's the disappearance of MH370 and Ashton Forbes' little orb thing, there's the pancake Earth, and of course there's many more. And for the most part, I feel we've been able to deconstruct them, explain them, and then put them aside into the dustbin where they belong. But there is one, which, no matter how many years go by, continues to vex me. Now, I want to be clear, it's not that I feel stumped, because I don't. It's that it's just so unbelievably stupid at every single level that I genuinely can't comprehend how it hasn't died. Maybe the education system just isn't cutting it, or maybe we went too far in our anti-bullying initiatives, but for some reason this one specific theory never seems to go away. If anything, it only seems to be growing more popular. I feel like when I first heard it, it already seemed destined for that dustbin of internet history. And yet, nearly a decade since I first saw these accursed ramblings on iFunny, it remains. Maybe it's the fact that I'm constantly placing the worst possible bricks into my algorithm, or perhaps it's just because one specific comment I left on a video 2 years ago keeps getting the most asinine replies, but I just can't get away. You see, I thought I'd put it to rest. I thought I had taken this nonsense out to the woodshed and buried it in an unmarked grave deep within the forests of Appalachia. But no, it persists. Never growing more reasonable, never ceasing in its lunacy. Sure, there have been videos which debunked it before I did, and there have been others since. But to be honest, I really believed that the 2.5 hours of coverage we did would have been enough. I had hoped that YouTube, in its infinite wisdom, when someone searched for this meat freezer IQ take on history, would do the right thing and place our series at the very top of the list. But that's not how it worked out. That's not to say that the videos which do come up aren't from reputable sources who have joined me in doing the Lord's work. The problem is that channels such as Kings and Generals or Geography Geek made the same mistake that most do. They assumed that this conspiracy theory is so utterly absurd that a simple 10 to 20 minute video would convince people to stay away from it. But when I search for the name of this abomination, I find myself served with short debunkings first, and then an inundation of materials supporting it. Many of them hours long and with hundreds of thousands of views. The result is that, on the surface, it looks like this theory has a lot more supporters than it does detractors. And I am seeking to remedy that problem. Now, while you can't simply delete history because, we have documents and artifacts and all sorts of other evidence that tells us the story that we're telling people is probably as close as it's going to get to the truth, what you can do is have your personal information deleted from the internet. And you can do that with today's sponsor, Delete Me. Delete Me is a subscription service where you sign up, you tell them, hey, here's the information that I don't want on the internet. And with Delete Me, you sign an actual privacy policy that they follow. Why do I emphasize that? It's because when you give Delete Me that information, you say, please get this removed from all of the listing sites. What is a listing site? It is something used by data brokers. What are data brokers? They're the people who, when you sign up, you're like, enter your email for 10% off green beans. You go and you enter your email, and then you do get 10% off green beans, and a whole bunch of people get your email address. Back when I worked in marketing, we had a saying, which was, if the product is free, then you are the product. And that is one of the truest statements ever made. And things like this are why you're constantly getting emails and phone calls and targeted ads telling you, hey, buy this product, or sometimes asking you if you need Medicare Part C and D when you're only 27 years old. And of course, it's just very annoying to get all of these scam calls, but the more important part is that sometimes that data actually does end up in places that you really don't want it. Places that are accessible to any given person with a credit card. Once your information is out there, there is a risk that you're going to have to deal with stalking, harassment, doxing, just all sorts of bad things. And really the only way to prevent that is to sign up for a service that does it for you, or to go to each and every single listing site and file the takedown request yourself, over and over again, because they only have to take down the listing the one time, and then if they find your email address somewhere else, they can go grab it. So what Delete Me does is it takes that information you give them, plugs it into an algorithm, and it scrolls through every single listing site they know of, and then they file takedown requests for you. And what I mean is they have a real person file the takedown request. And they do this over and over and over again to make sure that once your information goes up, it comes back down again. And probably the most relatable and most sincere issue here, because not all of you are going to have to deal with death threats like some of us are, identity theft. When all of that information's out there, it's not that hard for some, nefarious ne'er-do-well to go and get it and pretend to be you. And I'm not trying to fearmonger here. These are legitimate concerns in the internet age, and that's why we work with Delete Me. It is a very useful, very good service from good, reputable people. So if you're ready to have your inbox be less cluttered with spam, or to avoid being stalked and harassed by people named Proudfoot, or, just to try and have your identity remain yours, then you can actually get 20% off all Delete Me consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/lorelodge and use promo code lorelodge at checkout. Again, that is joindeleteme.com/lorelodge and use promo code lorelodge at checkout. Like I said, I thought I had done it, but maybe we were too small a channel to make an impact. Maybe the theory hadn't escaped containment enough for a video debunking it in painful, excruciating detail, and with the appropriate amount of sheer mockery, to cement itself in that honored position of first in the search results. I don't know what the reason is, but I do know I won't be making the mistake of doing it in two parts again. I won't err in assuming that because those who push this hypothesis never bothered to provide any real sources, I wouldn't have to either. No, I am using this juggernaut of a platform that we've built in the last 2 years since we first covered it to do what I should have done earlier. It is time to put an end to the lies. Ladies and gentlemen, Tartaria delenda est. Only slightly insane than the Flat Earth conspiracy, those who follow the Tartaria narrative believe that there was once a massive, almost world-spanning civilization stretching at the very least from what is modern-day Russia all the way to the east coasts of the United States, and that somehow, some way, within the past 200 years, it vanished and was covered up. Yeah. Now, exactly how large this empire was, as well as the time span in which it existed, are up for debate even amongst adherents of this, I hesitate to call it this, but theory. For that reason, I decided the best way to do this was not to pick a video myself, to pick a creator who covers Tartaria and go in on them, because then I might be biased. Instead, I decided to ask the Tartaria community who I should go with, and they gave me some options over on Reddit. The one I ended up going with was Mind Unveiled, not least for the fact that I am in the video. Now, Mind Unveiled is about the same size as our channel at the moment, and the video that we're looking at has over 200,000 views. So I feel like I'm not punching down or punching up, I'm punching directly in front of my face. Now, Mind Unveiled has a lot of videos. I reiterate, a lot of videos. Now, part of the problem I've run into with Tartaria is that there is a distinct lack of single video summaries of the theory, except for ones that are like 4 or 5 hours long. So, Mind Unveiled, in response to Charlie, Critical, having a stream where he asked the question, what is Tartaria, and pulled up a video where I kind of debunked part of the Tartaria thing, I decided to go with the video they made in response to that because that video was made as a direct summary for people not familiar with Tartaria. So I pulled that guy up and I started watching it live on Twitch and reacting in real time, and I realized if I can debunk this live, there's a good chance that I can absolutely bury it and that's going to be a joke you'll get later, I can absolutely bury it if I do a whole week of prep. A lot of the people watching this video may be completely confused by me saying Tartaria and be asking, what is that? What is this concept? Where did it come from? Tartaria falls within a similar vein to the phantom time hypothesis and the new chronology hypothesis. These are two pseudo-historical, the past is a lie, we have stolen history works that posit that at some point in time, the entirety of nations, geographical places, buildings, technologies, all of these have been scrubbed away deliberately. It's not the same thing as saying, there was an ancient civilization that was wiped out by a natural disaster. No, in the Tartaria narrative, all of this was very purposefully destroyed and hidden from the public. If this sounds familiar, the crazy Rome isn't real lady, all of her stuff is just like Anatoly Fomenko's new chronology. It's basically the same thing, except she flipped it, and instead of the medieval period not happening, Rome didn't happen. Adherents to the Tartarian narrative believe that the empire at some point constructed all of the major cities, buildings, important fixtures in the United States, Canada, and Siberia, and that European colonists just took over these cities as they were. For example, the Chicago World's Fair, they think that was ancient Tartarian architecture, not that it was built for the World's Fair and then deconstructed, which is what happened. According to theorists, we know about Tartaria due to things like buried buildings, old maps and documents, architecture we apparently can't reproduce today, and symbols used by secret societies. I will be addressing all of this. But the exact definition, as Mind Unveiled gives it, is as follows. Tartaria, the phenomena or category of alternative history that delves into the research of lost history and civilizations, hijacks and stolen buildings, magic, alchemy, and cloning, antiquitech, cataclysms, mud floods, buried buildings, star forts, and fortified cities, royal bloodlines and secret brotherhoods, asylums, orphans, and oddfellows, underground tunnels and waste management, and suppressed Moorish history. Now, I will tell you, out of all of those things that he mentioned, he didn't actually give evidence for all of them because some of it was covered in the first half of the video, and the way that this video was organized was really strange, so I'm covering the second half of the video, which is actually the part that sets up the first half, because I often try to give people the benefit of the doubt when I disagree with them that they're not trying to mislead people, but the way this video was set up made it feel very much that it was deliberately misleading people. Now, of course, there is an actual working definition for the term Tartary, and that is a vast part of Asia bounded by the Caspian Sea, Ural Mountains, Pacific Ocean, and northern borders of China, India, and Prussia, an area you probably know as Eurasia or Siberia. Now, the term Tartar seems to be of Persian origin, and it appears first in the 13th century, and it meant something along the lines of horseback riding messengers, and it was used in reference to the Mongols. It's first attested in European writing in 1270 AD in a letter written by King Louis IX of France, and he's writing of the present danger of the Tartars. The Tartars, in this case, most likely referring to the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde was a successor state of the Mongol Empire that was located east of what is now the European part of Russia. We're looking at, like east of Moscow. And the people who inhabited this region that was known as Tartary were a mix of Turks, Mongols, and Tatars. Now, the term Tatar came to represent a group of people who were neither Mongol nor Turk, but did live in and amongst the Mongolian population within their khanates and were also similarly horseback riders. And that is the very simple reason why you see Tartary on maps. It was the region inhabited by the Tartars. So, how do we get to Mind Unveiled's definition for Tartary then? The first bit of evidence we're given is what he calls the Irish connection. Now, I love this because we actually do have a video on the exact works he's citing already up on this channel within the Banshee video. So if you want to learn about the Levegaval and Erin and the Book of Invasions, all of that, you are welcome to go watch that portion of that video, but I'll get into where he gets things wrong as we go. The very first claim made about this is that today historians believe that civilization developed in Mesopotamia first, but in reality, according to Mind Unveiled, civilization actually developed in Ireland. According to Mind Unveiled, there is a shocking amount of evidence for this. Furthermore, the original version of Christianity was developed by this early original Irish civilization and was later hijacked by the Roman Catholic Church. As is usual with these types, rather than citing anybody writing in the last half century, he decides to cite an 18th century historian, 18th century linguists, people who of course were working with a considerably lesser body of knowledge than what we have today. So he found an 18th century historian and linguist who said he found a connection between the Phoenician languages and Irish. This tie between the two was discovered via a Roman Republic era play by Plautus called Penniless, in which a character speaks Punic. I believe the character is Hanno. Punic, of course, was the language spoken by the Carthaginians, and Carthage was founded as a Phoenician colony. And if you're wondering who the Phoenicians are, those are the people who developed out of the region known as Canaan after the Bronze Age collapse. Contrary to all available evidence, he claims that civilization first developed in the West and then moved its way east. He cites Ignatius Donnelly, who is a guy we covered in our Graham Hancock video. Donnelly was a 19th century writer, he was a lawyer and a politician, and part of the issue with all of this is that he lacked so much information that we have developed in the years since he was active that he thought that Celtic as a language derived from Sanskrit. I will, of course, first mention that Celtic is not a language, it is a language family, and that both the Celtic languages and Sanskrit developed out of Proto-Indo-European. And this also rests on a faulty understanding of Celtic culture in relation to the ethnicity of the Celtic tribes. Not all culturally, linguistically Celtic people were ethnic Celts, just like not all English speakers are ethnically Anglo-Saxon. Currently, it's believed that the Celtic culture developed somewhere in Central Europe, and then the language and art and such spread throughout the rest of Western Europe, but not necessarily the ethnic group known as the Celts. This led to a number of demi-Celtic societies, such as Celtiberians, Gallo-Thracians, groups like that, who were mixes between a group of people who lived somewhere and Celtic migrants and the Celtic language and culture, so they weren't fully Celtic. At this point in the video, he also goes over the term Aryan, because since a certain angry mustache man used the term, its meaning changed. It used to be, when you see Aryan pop up in documents from the 19th century, that they're referring to the Indo-Europeans, the Yamnaya culture and their descendants, the people we know today as most Europeans. Mind Unveiled points out the derivation of this word from some of the Middle Eastern Indo-European languages, where Arya meant noble, but he's really mistaken in saying that it meant noble in the 19th century, because it didn't. People using that term in that time period were using it to mean Europeans, Indo-Europeans. Another term you might see today is Caucasian, although that usually is used more for skin color. To back this up, he cites the Leveqvalin Erin, which of course is a Christianized national origin myth of the Irish, which the Leveqvalin Erin is actually drawing on earlier works that show somebody clearly added to it. But this work is considered a pseudo-history or a national origin myth based upon historical concepts. And the reason that I'm not going to look at it and say this is definitely correct, well, there's a number of reasons I could get into that are quite granular that are my background as a historian. But the one that I'll immediately point out is that this is the book in which a guy survives the flood of Noah by anamorphing into a salmon. Do you remember the anamorphing into a salmon clip? But that's all okay, because a man named Finton managed to survive the flood with some pretty wacky moves. Aiden, would you like to know what the wacky moves were?
Please tell me.
He became a salmon.
What?
And he lived for 5,500 years.
What?
As a salmon. He became a 5,500-year-old salmon.
How?
Nobody says. There is no information on how the man became a salmon.
So they really just said, man, salmon, I refuse to elaborate.
Exactly. Oh, he comes back later and tells this whole story to a later Irish king, by the way.
As a salmon?
No, he turns back into a man, I believe. Again, there is no original written record of any of this.
Got it, okay.
Yeah, weird.
We're off the reservation.
Yeah. This is like if you took Weird Bible, which is our other show. By the way, you can go check out the Weird Bible podcast over on its own channel, The Weird Bible. We do that with Wendigoon. But this takes the Weird Bible and just puts it on Coke.
Not the drink.
Not the drink.
Unless it's the old original formula.
Now, since we're on to the Irish and salmon men, you're probably wondering how the Phoenicians are still connected to this, and I will absolutely tell you. There's layers to this, and they're not necessarily easy to follow. Now, as I said earlier, the Phoenicians were kind of a successor culture of the Canaanites developing after the Bronze Age collapse, but according to Mind Unveiled, it's the other way around. And why is it the other way around? Well, because his semantic argument would be pretty inconvenient if it were the correct way. So how does he connect all this? Well, he cites a guy named Connor McDerry, and Connor McDerry claimed that the word Phoenician, which is spelled P-H-O-E, Nician, was originally spelled F-I-N-Ician, Phoenician. And according to McDerry, this is because Finn was the Old Irish word for sun, not like your male child, the big fiery ball in the sky, which, to be very clear, the Earth revolves around. Of course, this is completely and entirely wrong, as the Old Irish word for the sun was grian, and Finn did not mean that at all. It actually was a word that was derived from Latin, vino, it means wine, and the name Finn means fair, as in beautiful. He provides no supporting argument for his redefinition of these words. And he also claims that the Phoenicians were the first civilization to create an alphabet, which is technically true in the sense of a phonetic alphabet. The term phonetic derives from the word Phoenician. But he's kind of implying that this was the first written language, and that is not true, because Phoenician is predated by about 1,500 years by both hieroglyphics and cuneiform. He also claimed that they were the first to develop complex mathematics and to master maritime navigation. The math one is just wrong entirely, but the maritime navigation one, the seafaring, that's right. He got one right. He claims that mainstream historians will tell you that the Phoenicians settled in Ireland, hence the similarities between Gaeilge, Irish, and the Phoenician language. By the way, Irish is one of the younger Celtic languages. Now I have to argue with him because mainstream historians would not tell you that. That is absolutely not what we believe for the origins of the Irish people. Not even close. It is possible that some of this connection, if it actually does exist, which I am hesitant to believe it does, could be the result of the Irish likely being a group of people who left Iberia, what is now Spain and Portugal, a group of Celtiberians, who then went north and settled in Hibernia. Once again, the way he chooses to back up his argument is to claim that this is a legitimate scholarly theory and that it has been debated, but he cites nobody within the last 100 years, because this is not a legitimate scholarly theory that has been debated anytime recently. I also want to give a note on one of those, because Connor McDerry is a very, very Irish name, but the man who was using it was not very, very Irish. He was born in the United States, and his real name was John A. Guerin. As far as John A. Guerin goes, I cannot find anything about this man. He has no scholarly, no works, nothing. No credentials that I could find. Basically, every bit of information I was able to find on the internet is about McDerry's book on this specific subject. But to give you some more information about John Guerin, in case you're thinking, hey, well, you don't need to have a master's degree to be a historian, which I agree with. I've said it many times. To study history, all you need is an interest in history. But here's the thing. If you're going to write history, it's typically good to be able to cite your sources and to have coherent arguments and to not say things like, Atlantis was in Ireland, the Irish built the Great Pyramid, all British kings were Irish, the Bible was originally written in Irish, and that ancient Greek history was basically stolen from the Irish or just fiction. Those are all real things that John A. Guerin wrote. He also claims that the Irish built some of the oldest monumental structures in the world, but the oldest monumental structures in Ireland are still thousands of years younger than Göbekli Tepe. On top of that, there's the fact that the monumental structures he's citing, like Newgrange, were not built by the Irish. They were built by the people who lived there before the Irish, because the Irish probably weren't there until like sometime between 500 BC and 100 AD. We're not entirely sure when the Irish got there. So Newgrange, which I believe dates to about 3200 BC, predates the arrival of the Irish by about 3 millennia. During this entire nonsensical spiel, he also claims that one of the most prolonged conflicts the Roman Empire ever had was with the Irish, and that it was the English working at the behest of the Romans who finally conquered Ireland. There are some problems here, not the least of which is that the Romans and the Irish never fought a prolonged war, and on top of that, that the English and the Romans did not exist at the same time. In fact, the people who would eventually become the English weren't even in England yet. They were still over in the very dark and cold forests of northern Germany. He's got a couple of passages on screen that say these things, for the record. That's where I'm getting this information. One of those passages also says that the Irish sacred site at Tara, which is pretty important to Irish royalty in the medieval period, was renamed to Newgrange for some reason. But the problem is that both Tara and Newgrange are still standing and are about 10 miles away from each other. They're not the same site. It also may be worth noting that Mind Unveiled seems to be using Donnelly and Guerin kind of interchangeably, and it never actually tells you whose work is on screen at any given time. And if you were thinking, wow, this conspiracy theory hasn't gotten anti-Semitic yet, wrong. This theory claims, not that certain events in history didn't happen, that they never existed. There were no Hebrew people. Just totally blanket statement, Hebrews didn't exist. Now, of course, he's not saying that no group of people who were the Hebrews ever existed. He's just saying that the version we know of, that's not real. In reality, they were an Irish group, and their name came from Heber, from Ea. Now, he claims that word Ea, which he's saying is Old Irish, means fire. It doesn't. It also isn't the root of the word Hebrew in any way. And part of the reason I know this is because I am quite familiar with the Irish name meaning fiery one. It's mine, Aiden. And as far as his whole Hebrew derives from Heber, which derives from Ea thing, no, because Hebrew does not derive from Heber. It derives from a Greek word, Hebreos, which derives from the Aramaic Ibre, which derives from the Hebrew Ibri. And this whole obsession with personifications of the sun and such, by the way, he gives us like 4 different names for the sun in Irish and claims that all of them are names for the sun. Not a single one of them is an Irish word for the sun. But he works us back into the sun imagery by saying that Mil Espagnae, who is known as Milesius in the Leva Gvalana Erin, that he was a legendary forefather of the Gaels. Oh, wait, that's true. Oh, right, the personification of the sun thing. That's not. Mil Espagnae, of course, is a term that we believe derives from Latin and would have meant something along the lines of soldier of Spain. Why does this make sense? Well, considering that we have genetic evidence and cultural evidence that the Gaels were a Celtiberian group in Spain, it would make sense that one of their national heroes would be the soldier or hero from Spain who led them to Ireland. And this is an important piece of things because it's pretty likely that the Irish language developed in Iberia, not Hibernia. So you might be sitting here going, yes, of course, but how does all of this get us back to Hebrew and Irish? Well, it's because he makes a claim that Hebrew is in fact a dialect of Old Irish, which anyone comparing Old Irish and Hebrew can immediately see is not true. So I thought it would be fun to compare the phrases Hebrew is a dialect of Old Irish in both Old Irish and Hebrew, but the problem I ran into is that there is no Old Irish word for Hebrew. Now, of course, when I think of other dialects of the English language, like Appalachian, we have a word for that. You would think that if Hebrew was a dialect of Old Irish, there would be a Old Irish word for Hebrew. Along with all of this, he's been making the claim that there was a chief deity called Iesa, and that this was also an Old Irish term. The problem is, I could not find a single example of an Old Irish deity known as Iesa, whether Celtic or not Celtic. And part of the problem here is that whoever is being cited here, whether it's Donnelly or McDerry or any of these guys, they don't cite their sources, so I can't even tell where this idea is coming from. And then at this point in the video, he alleges that the Roman Church, apparently in agreement with the Orthodox Church, which is pretty weird for the time, decided to just reassign this language to a group of Syrian Aramaic speakers. Now, it makes absolutely no sense to say that Aramaic and Irish aren't related, but Hebrew and Irish are, considering the fact that Hebrew and Aramaic are very closely related. Certain books of the Bible may have originally been written in Aramaic and translated into the higher language of Hebrew. He, of course, supports this by claiming that there was only ever one Hebrew copy of the original Bible ever produced. I am going to assume we're talking about strictly the Hebrew Bible, not the New Testament here, but he claims that there was only one copy of the Hebrew Bible ever produced, and then it was immediately translated into Greek, and this was all to hide the deception. This is a horrific case of source analysis gone wrong, because the New Testament was originally in Greek, and the Old Testament was absolutely originally in Hebrew. So if he is talking about the whole Bible originally having one Hebrew copy, there was never an original Hebrew copy of the New Testament. And on top of that, the first known Greek translation of the entire Hebrew Bible is the Septuagint. It's called the Septuagint because the tradition holds that it was 70 scholars working independent of one another to translate the entire book into Greek, and then they all got together and compared notes. Which would mean that either they were all taking turns with the same Bible, or that they all had access to the source material, which means there would be at least 70 copies of the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew. It's also claimed that investigators have long been puzzled as to why the New Testament was originally written in Greek. Well, investigators might be puzzled, but historians aren't. It's because Greek was the lingua franca in the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and Christianity is a religion based upon proselytizing. If you went around spreading a book written in a language nobody could read, then it was going to be pretty hard to convert people who weren't already Jewish. He also claims that Hebrew was a language used specifically by the priests of Iesa, but again, I couldn't find a single deity with anything close to that name in the Irish Celtic pantheon. In fact, I couldn't find that deity in any Celtic pantheon. The closest I got was a minor Gallo-Roman deity named Essus, but he's only attested in 2 places on the mainland and appears to be a very, very minor deity who might even be Greco-Roman inspired and not originally Celtic. As far as I can tell, his worship is not attested anywhere in Ireland. And as I looked into some of the people that Mind Unveiled was citing, I realized that some of them are theosophists. He will do anything but cite an actual scholar. And why am I perturbed by his use of theosophists? It's because I hesitate to call it a religion, but that way of thinking, that philosophy, it claims that all of the knowledge they have is just kind of channeled to them by ascended masters who were members of some race or culture that existed in the distant past and learned to transcend time through a astral projection kind of system. I still don't totally understand it, but it allows them to get out of ever having to source anything because they just say, oh, well, the Ascended Masters told me. If you've ever watched the channel Spirit Science, you will be familiar with this. I will give you a quick spoiler of Spirit Science. There is no science. And, of course, when anything does argue with a theosophist, they'll simply claim that the source was corrupted. This entire thing with Ireland and Phoenician and all of that, he refers to as the Phoenician hijack, and I'm just going to tell you guys off the bat, I think I've done a pretty good job of debunking it through and through, but this did not happen. This is fake. This is absolutely not historical. And buckle up, because we're only a quarter of the way into this. At this point, I was also beginning to notice a pattern of Mind Unveiled not totally understanding what the Holy Roman Empire was, because he seems to use the terms Holy Roman Empire and Roman Catholic Church interchangeably. We'll get to a bigger clue to this later on, but those 2 groups were very often in conflict. Technically, they were on the same side, but there were a lot of cases where the Roman Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Emperor were not on the same page. He also doesn't even once mention the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is odd to me considering they would have had to be going along with all of this, and they weren't politically aligned with the Roman Catholic Church. He then claims that the proof is in the languages, culture, oral histories, and figures that are within the Bible, but he never once provides a single example of this. Everything he brings up either falls apart under the slightest scrutiny or is pure conjecture. And then he goes on to defend this whole inconsistencies and forgeries within the Bible thing with like a Reddit level of analysis of contradictions within the Bible. Like literally just him taking a verse completely out of context and wildly misinterpreting it. It seems he believes that it is more likely that all of this is a result of an attempt to rewrite Irish religion into a Middle Eastern framework than it is that he just doesn't understand what he's reading. Like, he claims that the facts presented by McDerry, read John Guerin, are undeniable. They're unrefutable, and yet I've refuted literally every single one he's presented. And then he goes on to say some stuff that shows his very obvious lack of education regarding the rest of medieval Europe. He claims that the Irish were specifically instructed not to read the Bible themselves, as they would note the similarities between the Bible and their own religion, their own ancient religion. Now, of course, remember, every Sunday they were going to church and having a priest read the Bible to them. And there's a couple of problems here, because Irish vernacular Bibles were not available that early. A lot of the Bibles they got were in Latin, and then either it was, they were explained in Irish, but a lot of these masses were in Latin anyway. So there's really no way that there's no way that this makes sense, because either the Irish would have had a Bible that they probably would not have been literate enough to read, even if it were written in Irish, but it would more likely be written in Latin, and privately owned Bibles were extremely rare because it's a huge book that takes forever to copy, and the only people who had them were churches and very wealthy people, so the average Irishman was not going to get his hands on a Bible. And I want to point out, the Irish actually lacked a standardized, commonly used writing system. And on top of all of that, commoners not actually owning or reading the Bible themselves was standard practice throughout all of Europe. You can argue absolutely over how much the Catholic Church was trying to suppress the independent reading of the Bible, but what you can't do is pretend that this was solely an Irish phenomenon, that they were doing so the Irish wouldn't notice similarities between their own cultural stories and their own language and the language of the Bible, which again would not have been in Hebrew. They would not have gotten a Hebrew Bible. Additionally, all the artifacts that we have depicting Celtic paganism refute this. They refute all of this. They show a broad pantheon of deities, a few of which are sort of a pan-Celtic. We see them all over the Celtic world. And then the vast majority are just regional deities, people who are associated with like a specific rock or a specific river. And while Celtic religion is certainly still mysterious to us, it was not monotheistic. We know that. And in what is probably one of the most smug and ironic parts of this video, he says that anybody with a basic understanding of Irish history can see that he's right, but I am someone with what is a comparatively advanced knowledge of Irish history, and I was pulling my hair out this entire time. I had to go to the urgent care and get my blood pressure checked. I'm on medication now already. I'm not actually. So to summarize, I did miss a little bit. I didn't quite give you the full story on what he believes happened here. He's saying that the Irish didn't even come from Spain, that the Irish were actually the survivors of the fall of Atlantis who landed in Ireland and then mingled with the other cultures there, and that's why a lot of different cultures have similar legends. Problem is, what other cultures is he talking about? There would have likely been one culture in Ireland at the time, if it was even inhabited to a large extent, and that culture was probably either whatever was native to the British Isles before the Celts got there, or similar to what would eventually become the Welsh. And on top of all of that, the earliest Irish artifacts in Ireland are from the late first millennium BC. They're not from 10,000 years ago. After this, of course, they migrated east all the way into the Indus Valley and possibly past that. And this migration is why we have so many cultures with similarities in language and faith and whatnot between Ireland and India. Now, of course, that would be the Yamnaya culture, migrating both west and south around 3000 BC, but, don't let that stop you. Now, of course, this migration continued into Tartary, and the reason we have the term Tartaria is because of that whole area thing, how area means noble. Now, of course, that is absolutely not the etymology of Tartaria at all. It was not denoting the presence of this noble Aryan race. No, it was a word that was denoting the presence of the Tartarians. It wasn't the presence of the Tarts, and it became Tartaria. There is no linguistic connection between the word Tartary and the word Aryan. They're not connected. Now, ironically, the answer to all of this is right on the very maps that he's putting on screen, where it says Scythians under the word Tartary. Now, the Scythians were a very well-attested and well-documented group of nomadic horse riders from the Eurasian steppe, and we hear about them from the Romans and the Greeks and the Persians. And of course, rather than citing anybody working recently with any modern discoveries, he goes back to citing Donnelly, who did not make the connection between Nennius talking about the Scythians as being the ancestors of the Celts with the Yamnaya culture. To give you an idea what I'm talking about there, I want to say 9th or 8th century monk by the name of Nennius, who lived in Britain, wrote a tract called Historia Brittonum, and this was the history of the Britons, the British people, the British Isles. And in that, he tells us about the 3 ancestral kings of the British Isles, Camber, Hibernicus, and Albanicus. And he claims that all 3 of these men were descended from a Scythian king who migrated west. Now, at the time, that might have made sense to them, but we know now that that's almost certainly mythological because those names aren't even Celtic. But he might not have been totally wrong. He might have just been kind of compressing and misunderstanding actual oral traditions which told a true story. The story of the Yamnaya culture migrating west into Europe and then establishing what eventually became the Celtic, Germanic, and other European cultures. So, of course, the idea that Scythian kings just left Scythia and came directly into Britain, pretty ridiculous. But he's not wrong to say that people from Eurasia did eventually make it to Britain. They did. And Donnelly he's not citing Nennius here, he's citing Levergvallen Erin, which does source Nennius. But we've already established Levergvallen Erin is absolutely not reliable, and Nennius is only partially reliable. And the picking and choosing of what to believe and not to believe from each of these sources, as most of these sources disagree with each other on one point or another, really does display a stunning level of cognitive dissonance. The fact that he can just kind of say, yeah, I'll cherry pick what I want from each of these and still fully believe in it. So either just incredible levels of cognitive dissonance, or this guy's a grifter, a fraud. And to remind you guys, we're using very outdated sources. I will say once again, Donnelly believed that Sanskrit was the mother language of Celtic. In fact, he didn't just believe it was the mother language of Celtic, he believed it was the original language of the Aryans. Think about all of that, and think about if you could use any of those terms at a conference and not be laughed out. Donnelly's problem was that he firmly believed that these Aryan languages, which we would now refer to as Indo-European, originated in the East, not in Eurasia. So for him, looking at the timeline of how these languages developed when and where, it doesn't make sense to him that Sanskrit could have migrated west to become Irish in the way that it did, but it didn't do that. Both of these languages are derived from a group that migrated in two separate directions, going west and south. That's why there's similarities between them, but there's no clear line through from one to the other. It's because they didn't develop in a linear progression. They developed independently from one mother tongue. And Donnelly also doesn't say anything about the differences between P and Q Celtic, or Insular and Continental Celtic. He just kind of acts like all the Celtic languages are one thing. In reality, if you look at Irish and Welsh, they are not as similar as you're expecting them to be. And here we get another historians will tell you, where he says that historians will tell you that the Celts were the descendants of the Scythians, which again, we would not tell you that. We would say that the Celts are a mixture of the Yamnaya culture and the native peoples of Europe. We also move on to yet another example of how Irish, clearly, how the Irish people, the Irish language, they were obviously the original society, right? The original civilization. Well, his reasoning is that the word Tartar shows up in a Gaelic dictionary. But the thing is that Gaelic dictionary has the word tattoo on the adjacent page, which means that the dictionary cannot date before the year 1700 AD. Considering we have the word attested in French in 1270, this point is completely moot. He also makes the claim that the Druids were the primary enemy of the Roman Empire, which is a really weird thing to say. There are two prime reasons this is nonsense. One of them is that the Druids were a class. They were a rung on the ladder of society in old Celtic cultures, and they were not the one at the top. The second reason is that Druids were present all over Celtic Europe. It was not just Ireland. And ironically, Gaelic Druids were essentially the only ones who were never in prolonged contact or conflict with the Roman Empire. And while he's talking about all of this, he has a source up on screen talking about Romans interacting with Druids, but if you go and you look at that source, it's actually talking about the invasion of Britain, not Ireland. Now, if you're like Mind Unveiled and you don't know that Druids were pan-Celtic, this might seem like evidence to you, but if you've, spent 4 years in college researching the history of the Celtic nations, you're pretty quick to go, And then, inexplicably, rather than citing, Julius Caesar about the Gauls, he cites Josephus, who was a 1st century AD Jewish historian. And on top of that, he doesn't seem to realize that the Gauls are not the Gaels. These are different groups. So he doesn't cite Caesar, he doesn't cite Ephorus, not Pythaeus. We don't get Polybius. No. We get 1st century AD historian Josephus. Not any of the Romans who directly themselves interacted with the Gauls or got their source from people who did. At this point, we move on, sort of, we'll keep getting called back to all of this stuff, but we start moving out of the Irish and Phoenician stuff into some stuff that's a little bit more concrete, which is what he considers to be geographic and historical inaccuracies. Or I guess inconsistencies might be the better term. We start off strong with him incorrectly dating a map to 1544 when it in reality was dated to 1587. The guy who made the map, Monte Urbano, he was born in 1544, which appears to be where the confusion came from. So what he does, he keeps showing us this map, and he's like, see, here it says Tartaria, or Tartarians, and there's little stuff underneath it. And he seems to be mistaking those little stuffs underneath it for names of cities, when in reality, those appear to be the names of tribes. And of course, he claims that they even crossed the Bering Strait and set up colonies in North America. And this is because of a spot in the obviously not totally correct North America, it was 1587, where there's a little note that reads, "Esubiri scestano alla campagna a modo de Tartari." And it obviously does not say that in modern Italian, it's in 16th century Italian, so I called one of my buddies who speaks Italian and took Latin for a while, and I figure, 8 years of Latin plus being fluent in Italian, he should be able to read this, right? We both struggled to figure out what the word Yesubiri was. I settled on Esubiri because it was the closest I could find, but the way the word was actually spelled, I couldn't find it even in contemporary dictionaries. It was spelled Jesubiri, and J was a pretty new letter at that point. I can't find it anywhere. I also couldn't find an Iesubiri, so I had to go with Esubiri. But what we determined is that this probably translates to, in this country they live in the Tartar way, though I am having trouble with that Jesubiri word. So considering how much effort I put into translating that word, I spent about an hour trying to figure out what this sentence and that specific word translate to. Unless Mind Unveiled is pretty fluent in early modern Italian, I'm thinking that he probably didn't look as deeply into this as I did. I will admit that does put the term Tartary into North America in 1587, but that's really not the argument he thinks it is. Since what it appears to be saying is that in this place, people live in the way after the mode of the Tartars. This could simply mean that he was discussing a semi-nomadic people who lived there, or that these were Native Americans who, due to shared ancestry in Siberia, looked like the Tartars. Either of these is possible, the former seems more likely to me. But there's also an additional problem, which is that the map is grossly inaccurate due to the lack of information that anybody living at the time had about the interior of the United States and Canada, or at least the places that would eventually become those, because you gotta remember, nobody had actually done expeditions into the interior. There's a reason the Lewis and Clark expedition happened. It's because nothing like that had been attempted at that scale before. So what they were using was descriptions from Native Americans about what was going on further inland. They didn't have the greatest resources here. And that's not to say that the Native Americans didn't have a good idea of what was going on further inland. It's just to say that between the language barrier and the fact that people do get things wrong, there were so many opportunities for information to be transmitted improperly. But I need to go into the details of that inaccuracy, and we'll have the map on screen, but you gotta understand how bad this map is. While it gets the coastlines largely close, it really misses on a few key points, such as the sandy desert northwest of the Appalachians that is next to an inland sea that is only slightly south of the Arctic Circle. Now, nothing about that is correct because the Appalachians are considerably below the Arctic Circle. There is no inland sea to their northeast, and there is no sand desert anywhere remotely close to them. And then there's the fact that it seems like this is supposed to be in Canada. He's talking about the Bering Strait and crossing over and all that, but if you look at directly east of the thing that says, here they live in the mode of the Tartars, what you'll find is that there's a tribe called the Iaguapai. Now, I couldn't find an Iaguapai tribe, but I was able to find the Havasupai and the Paiute, either of whom are possible options here. Or there's the possibility that it was a different group of people who were related. So what we're looking at here is, this is on the western side of the United States, or in the western side of Canada, because it actually looks very close to the Bering Strait on this map. Now the issue is that the Iaguapai are located directly northeast of the Quivira province. Now that was a province of the Wichita tribe of Kansas. On this map, Quivira is located northwest of Baja California. It cannot simultaneously be both northwest of Baja California and in Kansas. So anyone claiming that this map shows an accurate depiction of 1587 North America on the interior level is either ignorant or simply lying to you. But that is exactly what Mind Unveiled is doing in this video. He also doubles down on this, claiming that there are 3 massive cities depicted in Florida on this map, but what he's actually pointing to are 3 settlements. It doesn't say anything about the size of the settlement or even necessarily who lived there at the time. They could have been Spanish colonies. They also could have been Native American. So aside from the possibility that what we're dealing with here are just Native American settlements that are being listed on the map, there were also at least 3 European colonies in Florida by 1587. Now, it is possible that Mind Unveiled made this error due to his belief that the map was dated to 1544 rather than 1587, if I'm going to be charitable, but considering this guy denies the existence of the Jewish people, and therefore probably also the Holocaust, I'm not feeling charitable today. And there's a couple more issues here, which is that A, he doesn't seem to understand the process by which these maps were created, which a lot of it was word of mouth, or the fact that the Native Americans absolutely did have sizable settlements all over North America. And to be clear, these icons on the map that depict these population centers say nothing about the size. Nothing whatsoever. And he also says that a lot of maps of Asia from the 1400s and 1500s show cities that are not there anymore. But as we've established, these maps were not satellite images. It wasn't like somebody was making the most accurate map ever made here. These were general descriptions of kinda what this area looked like. On top of that, the names of cities change over time, especially between different languages. And I wanted to go in and check and see, oh, okay, well, maybe he is right. Maybe there are cities that have mysteriously disappeared from the maps, but he doesn't actually name any of the cities that he claims are missing. And then at this point, we get yet another appearance of theosophy, with him claiming that the Tartarians had a philosophical moral system, and that eventually this was stolen by what would become the Roman Catholic Church, and turned into Christianity and turned into religion, which of course ignores the fact that there are numerous non-Christian religions all over the world. And he also, in this exact part of the video, says, "We have been fed false timelines," which is just hilarious. And then we move on to Rome, because of course we do, where he claims that regarding the history of the Roman Empire, there are inconsistencies. He decides to cite Anatoly Fomenko, who of course is a Russian mathematician. You'll notice he never actually cites a historian or archaeologist throughout this entire program. In fact, basically everybody he cites is nowhere near the field of history, which would probably understand their complete lack of understanding of historical methodology. Anyway, Fomenko claims in New Chronology, his big book on this subject, that all of the events of ancient history, the Roman Empire, Alexander, that stuff, all of that actually happened during the medieval period, and on top of that, all of Asian and Arab history was just made up. Not real. Total fiction. Now, does that sound familiar to anybody that we've talked about before? To give you an idea of the scale of the ridiculousness of this book, this man believed that the Trojan War and the Crusades were the same event. Now, of course, the Trojan War is said to have taken place over about a decade, whereas the Crusades were 2 centuries, and they had completely different reasons and took place in totally different locations, with armor and armament that would not match. We've also found Troy, and we know where the Crusader battles happened, and the cultural layers are in different places, and they also have different artifacts from different cultures. So it's pretty definitive that Trojan War, whatever actually happened there, because obviously Homer's account is fictional, but it was based on something real, is the belief. Obviously, these are not the same event. He also mentions Josephus Scaliger, who Mind Unveiled claims is the father of modern classic history, the way that we do history now. Now, of course, Scaliger did no such thing. The current historical methodology is really only based in 1700s onward. At least that's when you could say that the modern field of history developed. Scaliger did have some pretty important contributions. He was one of the people who aided in the consideration of Persia, Babylon, North Africa as being part of Western history and something important to study alongside Greece and Rome. Now, ironically enough, the Jesuits, who Mind Unveiled has been claiming this whole time, are the people responsible for all of this rewriting of history, were not exactly fans of Scaliger. Scaliger and the Jesuits were not on the same page. So Mind Unveiled and the Tartaria community in general, I suppose, are claiming that Scaliger, who was not a Jesuit, and the Jesuits, who didn't like Scaliger, were instrumental to each other's work. And what do I mean by that? Well, Scaliger was a Calvinist. There was a whole iconoclast controversy between the Calvinists and the Catholics in France. And Mind Unveiled he very literally claims, these are the words he uses, that all of this history hijacking was done by religious fanatics, but the only two groups he's mentioned so far are Catholics and Calvinists, who did not like each other. And like a broken record, he cites yet another non-historian from before the 20th century, invoking Isaac Newton of all people, who wrote an amended chronology that has long been rejected. I'll say this, it's an intriguing read, but it's riddled with errors, not least of which is the acceptance of known mythological events and characters and legends as being real historical events. Our friend Mind Unveiled then of course claims that Fomenko had all sorts of evidence for his theories, but what's displayed on screen while he's saying this is utterly laughable. For example, he finds it odd that America is on a map from 1515. Thing is, the map he's showing, the map he's discussing, was assembled by a man named Gregor Reich, and it doesn't depict America. It depicts that there is a landmass west of Europe. And why might it do that? It absolutely does not depict the entire continent of North America. It's really just a vague showing of the East Coast and a couple of Caribbean islands. But you might be asking, well, did we know about North America then? Yes, we knew about the East Coast from 1497 when it was discovered by Giovanni Caboto, also known as the explorer John Cabot. As I said, he rediscovered the East Coast of North America in 1497 because it had obviously been discovered by people before that, such as the Native Americans and Leif Erikson. But in 1507, the title of America was applied to that continent after Amerigo Vespucci. And then, of course, there's the obsession with the letter J for some reason. You see, J has not been a letter for all that long compared to most of the rest of them. It was first considered to be a separate letter from I in 1524, and previously, it had kind of just been a stylization of the I, which sometimes had a utilitarian function, but for the most part, we were just looking at something that developed as a swoosh being added to the I. But it eventually began to mean something different, denote a different sound, and by 1524, I believe it was an Italian guy, decided, you know what, we should separate these letters. And gradually, it started to go that way. The letter J started to replace the letter I in certain contexts. Now, one of those utilitarian ways in which it could be used was to go at the end of a series of ones in Roman numerals to say, you know, this is the last one. And then eventually it came to represent a specific sound, kind of like the j in French. Over time, it eventually became a y sound in the Germanic languages and a j sound in English. And in certain cases, the J did see continued use in numerals, sometimes switching out the Arabic numeral 1 for a Latin J. And of course, this was part of the conspiracy. You see, it's because the X was originally used to denote Christ and the I was originally used to denote Jesus. And then eventually when the big rewrite happened, they changed X to mean 10 and I to mean 1000. Now, of course, if you know anything about Roman numerals, you know that I does not stand for 1000 at all. What actually happened is that during the Crusading era, the Latin West adopted Arabic Hindu-style numerals because doing math is a lot easier with Arabic Hindu-style numerals than it is with Roman numerals. Of course, the thing about IX, meaning Jesus Christ, can actually be true because Jesus was originally Iesos, and it was spelled with an I, and the X was used for Christ at certain times, but never in a numeric context was the IX used for Jesus Christ. In no way is IX Jesus Christ related to dating. On top of that, he doesn't show a single example of a date in which IX is used. Now, the claim here is that the three letters after I or J or whatever the first letter of those numerals was, those years were the actual number of years, and the J stood for Christ, stood for Jesus. So the year 1664, written J664, would actually mean 664 years since the birth of Christ. In reality, it was just a stylized I or 1. And of course, all of this is simply due to Fomenko's inability to understand the decentralized multilingual world of medieval Europe. Fomenko notes that dating and numerals are inconsistent across Europe, but in his mind, this is due to fraudulent redating later on, when that's really not the case. In reality, he can't read numerals. He takes something dated to 1597. It reads Anno MDXCVII. Now, MDXCVII is 1,500 97, or at least to those of us who know how to read Roman numerals. Simply due to the font being weird and archaic, he mistakes a D as a 1. In reality, D is 500, and if you look at this as MD XCVII, it's very clearly 1597. And the next so insightful point is that J, despite being one of the youngest letters in the English language, is also the fourth least used, which is just totally logical. If it's the newest letter, obviously it's not going to be used as much. If we were talking about, D, which comes from the Greek delta, that would be weird. But of course, the question has to be asked by Mind Unveiled, if J is such a new letter, why is it in so many biblical names? Well, if he had bothered to Google the original King James Bible, which was written in 1611 and is the most used, best-known English language Bible in all of history, he would see that the 1611 copy does not include the letter J even once as a capital letter. It does on occasion use J to denote a numeral. But what happened is that when the King James was printed in 1611, they were still using I instead of J. So his whole thing about why are there so many J's, it makes no sense because there weren't. They just, over time, as J became a more accepted letter, and they looked at it and said, well, we're using I differently now, and J is closer to the sound that we want here, so we're gonna put J here. For example, as far as they were concerned, Jacob or Jacob was a better pronunciation than Iacob, which is what it had been previously. Just like Jesus was better than Iesus, as it had been previously. Of course, Jacob comes from Jacob, which comes from Jakub, and of course, Jesus comes from Iesus, which comes from Yahushua. It also might be Yeshua, we're not totally sure. So this entire argument falls apart under, again, the least bit of scrutiny, and half the time the images he's showing on screen are just a 1 or an I. They're not even J's. And next, we get a very special look into how little Mind Unveiled knows about the process of creating a book prior to the printing press. He makes the argument that because we have no original manuscripts of certain texts, then they must just be later forgeries, right? An example he gives is the epistles of Pliny the Younger, claiming that the first copy we have of them is from 1471, while missing the text on screen from the image he presented, which says that they were working off of older manuscripts. A simple Google search returns the information that a 6th century copy of a Pliny manuscript was kept at the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York in the 1920s. So obviously, the earliest that we have from Pliny is not 1471. He also claims that we have no work of Pliny the Elder prior to 1400. In reality, we have copies of Pliny from the 5th century that have been preserved. So while these are not original copies, they are considerably older copies, and we do have original copies of some stuff from the 1st century AD. Or BC. So this entire point is rendered moot immediately. He then says history can easily be forged, especially when we're discussing a period of time in which the Roman Church still had power all over Europe. They really didn't, as at the time, the Roman Catholic Church was struggling quite a bit internally, as well as having some issues with the Holy Roman Empire and England. You might know of things such as the Conciliar movement, or, I don't know, the Protestant Reformation. He also says that the church at this point secretly moved its power into the hands of the Venetian families, and then does not elaborate on what that means at all. It's also apparently odd that much of the technology that the Roman Empire had was lost after the fall of the Western Empire. Except it's really not odd at all. Italy was sacked by Germanic tribes multiple times throughout the 5th century, including 410, 455, and 476 AD, with all of Europe falling to Germanic migrations by 476. The Germans, of course, lacked the engineering chops that the Romans had, and were also running from their own homelands, which had been overrun by the Huns. When you are trying to simply survive after being thrown out of your ancestral homeland and adopting the territory of a new country entirely, making concrete isn't really the first thing on your mind. He also reiterates the nonsense claim that we can't build some of the stuff the Romans did today, even though he never gives an example of a single building that qualifies for that. And to be clear, they never do. Every single time you ask one of these Tartaria believers, well, which buildings can we not build? They either give you a building we absolutely can, or they say that, you just need to look into it yourself. You just don't understand. And of course, the fall of Rome led us into a 1500-year dark age. As far as mainstream historians are concerned, again, I'm not sure he knows what mainstream historians believe, because we're not even using the term dark ages anymore. It's now late antiquity or the early medieval. In some places, it's called the migration period. Also, going by his own own dating throughout his whole theory, this means that the Roman Empire would have fallen around the year 1 AD, which it didn't. And as for those Dark Ages, well, even if we were to go with the old terminology, those only lasted 300 to 500 years after the fall of Rome. It wasn't 1500. Typically, either the reign of Charlemagne or the reign of William of Normandy is considered the end of the Dark Ages. We move into art history for a little while here, which he is absolutely atrocious at. He seems to think that art and music did not progress at all between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance era, which would be evidence that this entire period didn't actually happen, that the church just added 1,000 years of history. That, of course, is not remotely true, as art and music both went through their own independent stages all throughout the medieval period, with artistically broad brushstrokes. We're talking about the Byzantine, the Romanesque, and the Gothic periods. And of course, within all of that, there were plenty of minor movements. And if you look at the neoclassical architecture of the Renaissance period onward, in comparison to the Gothic architecture, it's very clear that there's a departure in here somewhere. That we didn't go straight from Roman to neoclassical. People branched off, they did other things in different places. There were revivals, there were reforms, there were all sorts of different artistic events that happened for this 1,000-year period. It's ridiculous to say that art and music made no progress, did not undergo any sort of change between 476 and 1450. Additionally, this whole idea of Rome adding 1,000 years to its history to glorify the Christian church, well, prior to the fall of Rome, which would have been, when all of this supposedly happened, prior to that, Christianity was only the Roman state religion for 96 years. To back up his claims about art, he uses a graph from the website Art in Context. Of course, another article on that website just roundly debunks everything he's saying here. And he claims that anything before the Romanesque period is just considered ancient, which is not true. And he also claims that there was no literature during the Middle Ages, so I guess Beowulf, the Arthurian legend, the Prose Edda, the Mabinogion, the Canterbury Tales, Piers Plowman, and all the other ones didn't exist. And I will say this much. You managed to get me to use Piers Plowman in a video, Mind Unveiled. Do you understand how bad you have to be for me to bring up Piers Plowman? Like, that is a niche thing to know about. And an absolutely huge piece of Mind Unveiled's argument hinges on this absolutely inaccurate understanding and misrepresentation of medieval artistic culture. And of course, wrapped into the issue of art is the issue of architecture. Mind Unveiled claims that many churches were actually not built as churches, but rather buildings meant to collect atmospheric energy via their spires. And of course, we didn't start to understand electricity in the 1700s with Ben Franklin, the key and the kite and everything. No, that's nonsense. That's Masonic symbolism. It was just invented to hide this, because Ben Franklin was the highest rank of Freemasonry. Ben Franklin and I are the same rank of Freemasonry. He was a 3rd degree Master Mason. The Scottish Rite, all the people who are like, oh, the 33rd degree Masons are running the world, that didn't exist yet when he died. He also claims that the 1812 painting depicting this whole discovery with the kite and the key thing includes a square and compass somewhere. It doesn't. There's no Masonic symbolism in that painting, and Benjamin West was not a Mason. If you do manage to find a compass in that picture, please tell me, because I looked all over it, and I am happy to be wrong, but if you find it, feel free to let us know in the comments. He also says that the spires atop these churches contained electrical components, and this is proven by the fact that you can sometimes see lights emanating from the top of these spires. Little weird, it almost looks like fire coming off of the church spire, right? By the way, I want to be clear, he's not saying that somebody has taken off one of these steeples and looked inside of it and found these electrical components. No, he's saying that just that weird fiery apparition around the steeple, that's the proof. The problem with this is that is called St. Elmo's fire. It is a well-known phenomenon, and it appears atop the masts of wooden sailing ships. Wood does not conduct electricity. Therefore, St. Elmo's fire cannot be what he's claiming it is. But at this point, he says that we may be getting too far ahead, and it's time to slow down and just talk facts. As you can imagine, there will be very few facts. I mean, we certainly haven't been speaking facts so far. Well, I have, but not him. So what are the facts we're speaking? Well, the fact that sometimes, in fact often, when one culture conquers another, they repurpose that culture's buildings. That's true. That is a fact. He then says that almost all Catholic churches in history were built upon old pagan temples, which is not a fact. Many churches were, certainly not almost all of them. In fact, basically none of the ones in the United States. But there was a deliberate practice of taking old pagan sites, pagan gods, and transitioning them into churches and saints. It was called Christianization, and the idea was that you could convert the pagans by making our religion more palatable to them, saying you don't have to necessarily give up your old gods, your old holy sites. We'll take your holy sites and make them holy in our religion, and we'll take your gods and we'll make them saints. And now you can still venerate them, all of that, but now your soul is saved, was the idea. Typically, it takes about 3 generations for a populace to change their religion. The first generation is going to look at it and go, well, you know what, I'll go along with it for the benefits. Second generation is going to sort of believe it and also probably maintain some of their older traditions. And then the third generation is usually the one that fully accepts the new religion. And this practice went on. The Romans did it, the Greeks did it, a lot of different cultures did this. It's possible that the reason we have Aesir and Vanir is that this happened when the original Norse tribes moved into the area and their religion intermixed with whatever the native religion was. Of course, all of this is up for debate and, still being discussed by scholars, but the practice of, religious syncretism is very well documented. And he uses this to say, this shows how old world buildings were repurposed for a new agenda. But in this case, there's a discrete reason. We are trying to convert a population. This does not mean that Tartarians built Chicago. He also references iconoclasm, which has been at the center of a few different church controversies. Generally, the idea is that iconoclasts believe that religious imagery is tantamount to idol worship, and iconophiles believe that there's nothing wrong with religious imagery. So iconoclasm is when iconoclasts deliberately destroy religious imagery and artwork for the sake of purifying the church. 2 of these controversies occurred between the Greek church and the Latin church in 726 to 787, and the other being from 814 to 842, wherein the Greeks were the ones who were iconoclast and the Latins were iconophile. It was actually one of the major controversies that led to the Great Schism. And if you don't know what the Great Schism is, that's when the Roman Catholic Church officially finally split from the Orthodox Church. And then another wave of iconoclasm happened during the Reformation era. The Reformation era iconoclast controversy was led by the Calvinists, who got into conflict with the Lutherans and the Catholics, primarily in France. Once again, this is not evidence that the Catholics stole Christianity from the Irish, as MU is implying. And we get into all sorts of weird stuff too, like he throws up an image of artillery wagons and claims that it's Huguenots, French Calvinists, moving buildings. One of these things is very obviously a cannon, and the other one is very obviously a supply wagon of some kind. And then we come to his discussion of cataclysm, which of course is one of the very important factors of Tartaria theory. He claims that cataclysms don't get a ton of attention in history class, but that medieval writers who just moments ago he claimed didn't exist wrote about it all the time. I don't know how that's possible. If somebody does not exist, how are they writing? But we're not talking about the flood of Atlantis here. We're talking about the cataclysms discussed by Plato in his writing, his work, Timaeus, which is the very Platonic work that discusses Atlantis. That's right. In the book about Atlantis, we're not talking about Atlantis. Also, Timaeus is not a medieval work, and I will point out that it claims the Earth is not flat in 360 BC. Plato knew the Earth wasn't flat. Why don't you? Not you as in the Lore Lodge viewers, you as in the flat earther who will inevitably find this video like they did the Chan Thomas one. Now, Mind Unveiled says that Timaeus describes, I'll quote him, details the cycle and resets of multiple past civilizations, not just Atlantis. Now, I want to really focus in on the terminology he just used. Details the cycle and reset of multiple past civilizations. Details, as in describes in detail. If you have read Timaeus, you know this is not true, and that the only civilization whose demise is described in detail is Atlantis. The others are just kind of a vague reference that, cataclysms of fire and earth have destroyed societies, which doesn't necessarily mean a globe-spanning advanced society, because we're talking about people who lived in city-states. And honestly, I'm not even going to bother with his claim that Plato's writings can only be dated to the 16th century, because we've already covered the fact that that's not true. No, I have to, because we have manuscripts with fragments of Sophist by Plato dating to the 3rd century BC. We have Plato dating to the 3rd century BC. Not 1600s, not 1500s. We have Plato from 100 years after Plato died. He then uses this argument that we have these recorded cataclysms. Of course, he has not provided evidence for this at all. He has simply said untrue things about Plato's Timaeus, he uses this to claim that civilization has been through multiple resets. The most recent of these resets? Well, lock in your guesses now, because, you guessed it, the War of 1812, which was part of the Napoleonic Wars, which are some of the best documented events in all of human history. His evidence for this is that there were some major earthquakes in 1811 and 1812, and that in 1811, he says 1812, but on screen it says 1811, a comet passed by Earth. Didn't impact, didn't enter the atmosphere, just passed by. A few earthquakes and a comet is proof that all of society was reset in 1812. He then departs this point to tell us that there have been multiple floods, even in recent history. He doesn't say when, just recent history, including mud floods. Well, what do mud floods have to do with this? Well, of course, the buried buildings. That explains why the buildings were buried. The concept, and I'll quote him on this, is that there were a series of floods that swept across the Old World, burying entire towns and cities throughout Europe and America beneath layers of mud and debris. Mentions archaeological tells, which are basically spots where you can tell that there was some sort of development because of the accumulation of dirt on top of buildings. But he mischaracterizes these as things that were suddenly buried by flooding. Keep in mind, they protrude above the landscape. That's how you can tell it's there, is that there's a mound above the surrounding landscape. But he claims that this was something that happened immediately or rapidly, rather than something that happened gradually over time, which is almost always what happened. And then he makes the claim that old world buildings, a term that he does not give a definition for at this point, extend multiple stories beneath the ground, and it's just been buried. And here he does something that does feel pretty deliberate to me, which is that he talks about the very real phenomenon of raised streets in cities, basically entire projects where they raise the street level an entire story, and if you dig underneath it, you can see that there's, a door and windows and everything because the streets used to be a story lower. He talks about that while showing pictures that are edited images of Seattle. They're artistic depictions or just photoshopped, things like that. They're not real images. So he's talking about something real while showing you something fake so that you make the connection in your mind between these two things, even though the fake image is fake. He does show some real photos, but all of them show one, maximum two stories that have been buried. And of course, that burying was deliberate. All of the real images have very legitimate explanations, like urban redevelopment or soil liquefaction. And then of course, he calls our attention to all of the many flood stories from myths from around the world, but he neglects to note that all of these are prehistoric. They were written down later. They all talk about this being something that happened in the ancient past, not something that happened to their grandma. And of course, if these are a reference to anything, it's probably Meltwater Pulse 1b, that time 11,600 years ago when the sea level raised by 60 meters in 1,000 years, with like 20 of those occurring in the first 100 years, which would very much appear to be a global flood to the people living at the time. It was not a series of mud floods, as he says, and also I have to ask the question, where is the mud coming from? Because he uses the term mud volcano at some point in the video and never explains what that means. Now, half the pictures shown during this segment have nothing to do with the topic at hand, and let's also not forget that he just claimed the most recent of these mud floods was in 1812. He also references a manuscript known as the Book of Miracles, which was written in or around the 16th century, no earlier than 1545 AD. He claims that it depicts multiple cataclysms in detail, and that these are presented not as natural disasters, but by acts of a higher power. And anybody remotely familiar with art of the medieval period will not find this odd at all. I am completely unfazed by the fact that they had a book depicting cataclysms as acts of God. That was totally par for the course for medieval people. This is probably the period in history when religion was more important than it ever was before or after. And the contents also aren't exactly what he claims, as they're not really disasters that we don't know about. Things like Vesuvius, the Flood, and Revelation are depicted, alongside some events like comets that pass through the sky, and some things like the 5 suns over Leipzig, which at the time might have seemed really weird to medieval people, but now we have astronomy, and we can sort of explain some of these things. Also, you need to remember that the artist didn't actually see half the events that have been depicted. They are artistic depictions. They are what he believes it may have looked like. When you actually read the descriptions of these photos that are given on the page, they're in German, but when you read them, all of them become a lot less mysterious. But I'm sure the UFO lovers will be all over the 5 Suns of Leipzig one. But you need to understand that this is taking this book and saying, well, clearly everything depicted here happened, is kind of like believing everything the tabloids say. Then we're on to the Ark of the Covenant, which he claims the Canaanites had. They didn't, the Jews did. The Philistines also did at one point, but it kept causing problems for them, and they weren't Canaanite. He also claims that it was a very powerful weapon, beyond our modern technology, said to be a weapon of mass destruction. As you might expect by this point in the video, he provides no evidence whatsoever of this, although he does steer clear of saying it was aliens. Instead, it was black magic. Considering the Ark of the Covenant is solely attested in the Abrahamic faiths, and not one of them describes it as a weapon of mass destruction, it appears that he simply made this up. Or he's reciting somebody else who simply made this up.
Now what's that supposed to be coming out of there?
Lightning. Fire. Power of God or something.
Now, of course, when the Philistines take the Ark, they do have boils show up and statues get knocked over and so on and so forth. There's also the fact that it's used at Jericho, but the Ark doesn't, it's not like the Ark fires some sort of destruction beam at the walls of Jericho or like it's emitting radiation. It's just a vessel for God. It's literally a symbol of the power of God and his commitment to Israel and Israel's commitment to him. But you didn't think that the use of the word magic would stop here, did you? Of course not. Magic is deeply involved in Tartarianism because, according to Mind Unveiled, every medieval court, every single one, all of them, every one, had an astrologer or a master alchemist. And according to him, these people weren't just making predictions or turning lead into gold. They were manifesting these cataclysms. For what reason, I'm not sure. As far as the whole every court in medieval Europe, which again, we were told didn't exist, but moving on, every court in medieval Europe having its own astrologer and alchemist is only partially true. It's really only true to the latter half of the Middle Ages, and also not quite accurate as to what these people's roles were. Your astrologer or alchemist was not a court wizard. This was a scientist, essentially. It was somebody who was educated in various of the time sciences. Amongst those were astrology and alchemy, which later on gave way to the actual scientific fields of astronomy and chemistry. As the actual physical realities of the world became better understood, science changed. And as far as the whole manifesting cataclysms thing, Mind Unveiled admits that was pure conjecture, aka he made it up. And then we get a cascade of photos completely out of context, which Mind Unveiled is claiming are proof of these buried buildings and the mud flood. But the problem is, not a single one of the pictures he provides is remotely weird. The first of the pictures that he shows was taken during the expansion of what is now Kansas City back in 1871 after the city was first settled in 1821. Now, the location of Kansas City had a natural rock ledge that extended into the Missouri River, which made it a great spot for a port and a ferry. They didn't have to lay new foundations and build an entire port. They could basically start using that spot immediately. The problem was that strip was pretty narrow, so in order to expand the city past, a few dozen meters inland, they had to go and dig out some rather large hills. So initial building happened wherever it was possible, but when they wanted to expand the city, they had to dig into the 30,000 or so year old level of sediment that had accumulated atop the limestone. So this process of expanding Kansas City into the hills is what led to this picture being taken. They weren't uncovering buildings, they were digging out hillsides, and all that happened is Mind Unveiled got confused by the perspective created by the photographer's position in relation to the building he was photographing. The second appears to be the corner of Broadway and Franklin in Manhattan, and there is nothing about the picture that suggests it has any purpose in being included in this list, and Mind Unveiled doesn't actually explain why the picture is there either. The third picture given is an image of St. Mary Magdalene Church in Omaha, Nebraska. At the time that the photograph was taken, they were expanding Omaha, and it had a similar problem to Kansas City. They needed to dig out and regrade some of the area so that they could build bigger buildings on the western side. Previously, the church sat atop a hill, which was then excavated, and a new foundation was built for the church. You can see where the old front doors were, and how they are now a fire escape. The church is still there to this day. The fourth depicts an old well constructed by the Manhattan Company, unearthed during excavations for the building of the Courthouse Square building in 1926. They dug out to build the foundation. His reasoning for including this one seems to be that it was weird that the streets were made of dirt and horse poop, as he claims, which is not an accurate thing to say. And he's asking, how is it possible that the Romans had paved roads and American cities in 1926 didn't? Not accurate. First of all, he's wildly overestimating the number of paved Roman roads in existence, and he's wildly underestimating the number of paved American roads in existence. And he's acting like Roman cities just started off with roads and cities don't take time to develop. Additionally, Rome was founded around 753 BC, and the first major Roman paved road wasn't constructed until 312 BC, 441 years later. So we have 441 years where the Romans don't have paved roads, and he's like, curious. The Romans, 1,000 years into the development of their civilization, had paved highways, and yet American cities, a couple dozen years into their creation, didn't. How curious. Also, it's not like the Romans were paving with asphalt. The Appian Way, the first major Roman paved road, is giant blocks of stone laid next to each other. It's not a modern road by any stretch. The fifth photo is one taken in Berlin in the 1850s, and this remains on screen as he proceeds to say that America had no proper waste management system until after 1900. This isn't remotely true, as we were developing city sewer systems as early as the 1850s. Prior to that, you just used an outhouse. And the wealthy had actual flushing toilets that went into a cesspit out back it was like a modern septic tank. And he kind of displays the whole idea that medieval people used to just use a chamber pot and then toss it right out into the street, but that's not something that actually happened, at least not at any large scale. In the Middle Ages, what you typically did was either bury your waste or throw it into the river. Of course, that's not super sanitary, but it was better than throwing it into the street, and there were a lot less people. The whole idea that medieval people were doing this was kind of invented by Victorian-era historians who just wanted the medieval period to seem as gross or more gross than the Victorian era. In reality, medieval London was probably a lot cleaner than Victorian London. And then, without even remotely trying to provide evidence, he claims that people were using Tartarian water pipes, basically whatever they used to run water through their cities. We started using those as sewers, and somehow this led to cholera outbreaks. Of course, this does not explain why England had cholera outbreaks, and it also skips the fact that we didn't have any idea how disease actually spread during the cholera epidemics. They're what led to germ theory. Cholera is why we know how bacteria work. And the most explanation he gives as to this whole Tartarian water pipe sewer system thing is that he has to get into it in another video because it has to do with Tartarian spirituality and diet. I'm not sure what they could have possibly been eating that did not require a sewer system we would recognize, and he's claiming that we just didn't know how to use theirs and that's why we got sick. It's actually one of the least supported arguments he makes, and these arguments are aggressively unsupported throughout. And in his mind, this whole we didn't have any sewage systems, which again, really not an accurate way of describing things before 1900, but we'll move on. This somehow has to do with star forts, you know, those big Civil War era, Napoleonic Wars era forts. And this is because urban sewage and rural military emplacements constructed strategically in places that were chosen for a variety of reasons, such as, I don't know, their proximity to a river. Those are the same thing, apparently. There's no differences between city planning and military fort planning. And he shows a complete lack of education about these forts by claiming they had no bathrooms or plumbing. At the very least, all of these forts would have had latrines and outhouses. Some even had basic plumbing systems. And by the end of the 19th century, officers' quarters had flushing toilets. And I'm not certain exactly when they started to add in actual indoor bathrooms, but the common soldiers eventually did have indoor bathrooms. He also seems to think that the Roman sewer systems were considerably more advanced than those of the late 19th century, which is not true. They were very similar to those of the late 19th century. The Romans just didn't have flushing toilets. And oddly enough, he seems to imply that star forts were somehow an American thing and that they were first built during the 19th century, but there are star forts in Italy from the late medieval period. And then he asks how the star fort that is in Pensacola, Florida, was built on such soft sand if it's made out of concrete and brick. I mean, how could we possibly, with the technology of, 1826 or so, how could we possibly have built a star fort on top of a beach? And he specifically seems to be referencing Fort Pickens, which was built between 1829 and 1833, which I will note is long before the Civil War, and he calls them Civil War forts throughout the entire video. And one of my favorite things about it is the level of smugness in his voice as he asks how we're supposed to believe that they built these on such soft sand, with 1800s technology. Meanwhile, he seems completely unaware of the fact that these forts were built upon foundations, and that what they did was dig out the sand underneath where the fort was going, and then fill it with concrete or lumber or any number of things to create a level, solid surface, because sand on American beaches typically only goes down about 1 to 3 meters and can easily be dug out when you're constructing something, because you can just sit it on top of the bedrock, which is exactly what they would be surveying for before building a fort. It's not like they just went, this beach is pretty nice, I think I'll put a fort on it. No, they needed to find a place first where they could build a fort. So if the fort is there, it's because they were able to build the fort. They wouldn't have built the fort if it were on top of like 5-meter thick sand dunes. Like, astonishing lack of reasoning skills. He then says, the explanation is that they were built during the Civil War to protect America's coast, but this isn't true as many of these forts were actually based on older forts. Somehow he cannot comprehend the idea that some older forts were rebuilt as well as newer forts being built during the Civil War. It seems to be a statement of, if there were older forts, there can't be newer forts. He also keeps saying that they were all built during the Civil War, which is not true because the Civil War was not happening in 1829. They were just continuously building forts where forts were needed, hence why there's forts all over the country. And oddly, he also notes that the Spanish and French were building forts in the area even earlier, but he denies that these forts were made of wood at first, which is basically how all fortifications are initially constructed. Is usually you start off with the quickest building material, and then as the position becomes more important and you can devote more resources to it, you start adding more and more building materials. The original castles were Motte and Bailey castles made of wooden palisades, and then eventually we got the stone ones. The same thing happened with a lot of colonial forts. They didn't have the stone laying around. They had to build the fort out of wood, and then once they were safe, they could start quarrying stone to build a stone fort. As far as he's concerned, these stone forts were already there, and all of this is a lie. And he says the entire story of the colonization of America is a fabrication. He says, we're told that countries such as Spain, France, and England were all fighting each other in the pursuit of the colonization of America, but who funded these projects? Well, the answer is pretty simple. The royal houses and governments of those countries. This was a system called mercantilism, where national governments would fund and sponsor expeditions to set up colonies, so those colonies could then produce materials that couldn't be produced in England to be sent back to England. Often, a mercantilist society would not allow the colony to produce finished goods, but rather raw materials, so that they had to buy their finished goods from the mother country. Yes, this is a big part of what led to the American Revolution. But no, it wasn't mercantilism. It wasn't the well-documented logical reason that colonization happened. No, it's it's that they were all under the control of the Holy Roman Church. And to see this, all you need to do is look at its coat of arms. First of all, England was Protestant by that point, so not Roman Catholic, not under the control of the Roman Catholic Church. And guys, remember that weird remark earlier about the Venetian families? Ladies and gentlemen, Mind Unveiled does not know the difference between the Roman Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire. Because the coat of arms that he's talking about is the crest of the Holy Roman Empire, the double eagle on a yellow or gold background, with all of the crests of the various member states on it. These aren't family names as he's suggesting, they're states like Trier, Brandenburg, and Lübeck. As a side note, I really don't think he knows about the Byzantine Empire. I think he's unaware of its existence. Now, I should probably take a moment to explain what the Holy Roman Empire was, for your benefit, if not for his. It was not holy, it was not Roman, and it was not an empire. The Holy Roman Empire was initially created in the year 800 AD, when the Pope crowned King Charlemagne of France as the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, at the time, he did this because the Western Roman Empire had fell, and the Eastern Roman Empire didn't have an emperor. The idea was that Charlemagne could then claim the Eastern Roman Empire as well as his own holdings in France, Italy, and Germany. Charlemagne actually really didn't like this, and legend says that he tried to strangle the Pope and his own men had to hold him back. Over time, it morphed into something else, and it became something that was more of a confederation of states who all fell under the authority of an elected Holy Roman Emperor who was the king or duke or prince of whatever state ended up being the leader for that period. All the other elector states would vote for who the emperor would be. And this was kind of the de facto government of Germany for a long time. As far as actual power went, the Holy Roman Empire was pretty weak unless it was fighting against another larger nation that posed an existential threat to the various member states. It was not the Roman Empire. And by that same token, it's important to note that the Catholic Church was not the Roman Empire, and that the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire had a lot of controversies, and they did not get along a lot of the time. The Catholic Church was much closer to the crown of France than it ever was the Holy Roman Emperor. But, as you'll see on the illustration, conspicuously absent are the crests of France, Spain, or England, the three countries he claimed were being controlled by the Holy Roman Church Empire. And he manages to do this with two separate illustrations. The second one is a woodcut known as the Triumphal Arch of Maximilian, and it was made for Emperor Maximilian I. Not Roman Emperor, Holy Roman Emperor. It was actually designed partially by Albrecht Dürer, who was a very famous artist. He claims that this depicts all of the royal houses and the lineage going back to this elite line of Roman emperors from the past. It actually doesn't, and it doesn't connect Maximilian to any Roman emperor. It connects him to Clovis, one of the kings of the Franks. It's not the royal lineage of the Roman Catholic Church. It's not the lineage of even the Holy Roman Empire. It's specifically the lineage of Maximilian. And if you look at the rest of it and read what art historians have said about this thing, it's not depicting anything like what he says. And he uses this hilariously wrong misunderstanding of the Holy Roman Empire to claim that all of the cities in America were Tartarian, and that the Europeans just moved in and joined, just conquered them, just took them over, because Tartaria just disappeared after the mud flood. So the Europeans came in, they dug out the cities, they occupied them, and then they said, no, we built these. And of course, these Tartarian cities had sewer systems that only the Tartarians could use, hence cholera. And he also does something really weird where he claims that all of the ancient European cities are actually massive star forts, and that this is because they were all constructed initially as fortified cities, and that the city radiated out from the star fort. The ones he cites are Paris, which was established around 259 BC, and Amsterdam, which was established around 1275 AD. So obviously, these two cities are not the same kind of ancient at all. And the cities themselves are not star forts. They are fortified cities that sometimes have a star fort attached to them, inside of them, or just outside of them. Now, we have a term for a fort that is either inside of or part of a city, and it's citadel is the word. They go back to the earliest walled cities. The Acropolis at Athens, for example, that was a citadel. It was a spot within the city that was heavily fortified. And the purpose of a citadel was that if the attackers broke through the settlement's main walls, you could then retreat to an even more fortified position where you wouldn't be able to protect your belongings, but at least you wouldn't die. And all of this, supposedly, was done to hide the true history so that the church's elite families could run the world. He says that the idea was that some of these Roman Catholic elites hired occult Protestant thinkers, and of course, occult Protestant is a completely oxymoronic term, because you can't be both Christian and occultist, but they were hired by the Catholics to create a concept of a new Atlantis, a new utopian world. And that new utopian society would be ruled by a set of technocrats, basically. It would be ruled by technology, by those who created and ran all of the new tech. So he ties this to electricity, claiming that the Tartarians were able to suck electricity from the air at no cost, and that's the thing that we're going for here. The whole reason was, I guess, so that we could have oil instead of free energy. There's really that makes no sense at all. Like, if we already had free energy, they probably would not have covered it up for the far less efficient oil. But more importantly, we've shown that the things he claims were collecting this electricity weren't doing that they're just spires on buildings made of non-conductive materials. But as far as the free electricity thing goes, blimps are somehow evidence of this. And to prove this, he shows two of the most obnoxiously doctored images I have ever seen in my life. One depicts a couple of blimps moving the Arc de Triomphe, and the other shows a couple of blimps moving an obelisk in France. The problem is that both pictures use the exact same blimps at the exact same angles. They are obviously early fake photographs, or they're later fakes that are meant to look like older photographs, but they're very obviously, when you look at them side by side, not real. These are not real pictures. And he also claims that this is why we even have footage of the Hindenburg disaster, that there was a photographer set up there for the sole purpose of taking a picture of this thing blowing up and falling to the ground so that people would move away from blimps and they wouldn't ask questions about the free electricity. Again, the timeline here is very confusing because he said 1812 earlier, but now we're saying that the Hindenburg disaster was staged to convince people to move away from blimp technology in 1937, when airplanes were becoming a thing. And they really didn't need to get rid of blimp technology because airplanes are a hell of a lot faster than blimps. And this is where we finally come to the end of this video. But of course, we're gonna need to make a second video because there's a whole other half of this one that, like I said earlier, the information you kind of needed at the beginning is pushed to the second half of the video for some reason that I don't understand what that could serve, except to confuse people and maybe make them more willing to believe because you save the real nonsense for later on. But he does, at the end of the video, come to a point where he says something that's rather meaningful, which is that we're taught a dull, boring version of history in school, and that nobody's interested in history as a result. And I think he's actually right about that. History does not have to be boring. It does not have to be dry and something you feel like you're being forced to learn for reasons you're not going to understand. History can be fun and exciting. And if teachers did a better job of making history fun and exciting, people wouldn't be so historically illiterate as to believe in Tartaria. But like I said, we've been able to debunk every single point he makes, except for like one, which is a more theological point, which is hard to get into, but him challenging it doesn't actually bring up the necessary level of argument for me to even indulge it. The other thing that I forgot to mention before this is the flag of the Empire of Tartary, which is not the flag of the Empire of Tartary. It is a flag included in one book by a Dutch guy named, I want to say, Karl Allard. And what it says is that it is the flag of the Caesar of Tartary. Now, what it appears to actually be is a royal flag of the Kazan Khanate, and it may or may not have actually been the flag of the Kazan Khanate. The reason it's thought to be is that it depicts a creature on it that is a creature of Kazan folklore and national symbolism. And that people group, that ethnic identity, that still exists today in Russia. They're still there. What they most likely were was a successor of one of the Mongol states, and that they just existed. We didn't totally understand much about stuff over that way, and this Dutch guy just used the wrong term because Tartar was going to be more familiar to Europeans than Kazan would. And I want to reiterate that I wasn't always planning to do a video on Tartaria debunking the whole thing, because I honestly think it's silly for the most part. But looking into it, I'm glad I did, because this is a lot more insidious than just believing in Atlantis. You know, if you look and you say, oh, I think that there probably was an ancient civilization that was wiped out by a flood a long time ago. There's no harm in that. Tartaria denies the existence of multiple ethnic groups and their histories, not just the Jews, but also the Arabs and the Chinese and the native Siberians and the Celts and a whole bunch of other groups, basically. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's an existential threat to you or to society or academia, but it is something that a shocking number of people are willing to believe, and it does suggest to me that there is a deep sickness within the historical community, that we need to get better about confronting these things before they're allowed to spread. Because as you saw with this video, an actual trained historian can sit here and knock off every single one of these points rather effortlessly. It wasn't that it took me a long time to disprove any of this stuff. It was that there was so much nonsense per 10 seconds of video that I had to spend hours per minute of video researching just to debunk how many lies were told. It wasn't that they were difficult lies, it's just the sheer number of them is astonishing. So the truth is, I don't know whether Mind Unveiled is a grifter. I don't know whether all of these big Tartaria channels are just doing it for the money to trick stupid people into believing them. But whatever they're doing, it's not good, it's a problem, and it probably should be confronted by the people educated enough to do it. And of course, like I said, there is an entire first half of that video that goes over a bunch of other evidence, and trust me, we will be doing a video on that as well. This is part 2, and I would recommend going back and watching part 1 first. I just want to get that out of the way, but in case you haven't, here's a quick recap. In a video a couple of weeks ago, we covered specifically the channel Mind Unveiled's version of Tartaria, what that means, what it is, who the Tartarians were supposedly, and basically all of his evidence for it, at least from half of the video. We covered 30 minutes of an hour-long video in that because it was that dense. As for why we chose Mind Unveiled's channel, I will reiterate this despite the fact that he leaves it out of his response video, but we chose Mind Unveiled because we asked the Tartaria community who they thought did a good summary. Someone that we could just take one video and go through the points in that and handle it that way without going through every video on a channel. And the most popular result was Mind Unveiled, whose Reddit account constantly is posting videos of Mind Unveiled's channel to that exact subreddit. So I felt, that makes sense. Also, in his summary video, he uses a stream from Charlie, Moist Critical, that I appear in, so it just kind of made sense. To briefly respond to something that was said in Mind Unveiled's response video, I did not choose your video because I was salty that Charlie didn't choose my 59-second short to understand what Tartaria is. And speaking of that last video, I want to address some things because this turned into drama and I really didn't expect it to. Many people in the comments accused me of picking the most insane possible YouTuber on this subject. That was both on Reddit and here on YouTube. I just explained why I picked Mind Unveiled, and I've been looking into other people like Robert Seffer, who people seem to have a much higher opinion of. So I'll be looking at that as well because apparently Mind Unveiled is out there and fringe. I was also accused of not doing my own research. I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean, but I have the notepad right here, and I promise you Aiden's not doing the research. He has another day job. But to prove that I do in fact have all 88 pages of handwritten notes, I'm going to post the scans publicly on Patreon, so you'll be able to see it without subscribing. There was also a point made about how this theory tends to lean into anti-Semitism in some cases, and that Mind Unveiled does use a couple of those points. Now, people claimed that I was accusing him of anti-Semitism without the appropriate evidence, so I'm gonna leave that out of this video so people can focus on, all of the points I'm debunking and not the notion that this may be a little racist. I'll say I am willing to give him the benefit of the doubt that he himself does not hold anti-Semitic viewpoints, but the theory does go there often. And not necessarily his version of it, but there are some things that come up in his sources that are pretty rough. One example of this would be that Michael Sarian, somebody he cites quite often, says basically that World War II is misunderstood and that the Germans weren't necessarily the bad guys in the way that we think, which, Also, because it has been publicly commented now, and I do have receipts, when I did ask him publicly about his opinion on the Holocaust, he said that he needed to do more research and they had never done a video on it, so he didn't know. And to be abundantly clear, I have reached out to him privately to clarify his position, and he has since refused. And a few people said that I was condescending in that video, and I will admit that there were a few moments where I probably did sound a little condescending or arrogant. That said, most of the people saying that I was condescending or arrogant didn't actually watch my video and just watched Mind Unveiled's version of it and admitted to that. But I do know that I have, in my life, had a tendency towards, arrogance and a big ego, and I have worked to remove that from my personality to the best of my ability, but sometimes it does come out. And when somebody claims that the nations of the Holy Roman Empire represented on the coat of arms are actually Phoenician families planted there by the Catholics, including England, despite the fact that England was Protestant and is not on the coat of arms, it's hard to not be condescending. Additionally, there was this was kind of an in-kind response to how his video was done, and there are a few quotes in here where I'll point out exactly when he said something that came across to me as a little smarmy. Two of those particular comments that I covered in the last video were one where he's basically like, come on guys, we don't really believe that Ben Franklin did that thing with the key, right? All because Franklin was a Mason. Not anything to do with the possibility that the story is apocryphal, it's just that because he was a Mason. The other one is when he's like, come on guys, do you really think that people could build star forts like this on sand in only 1800? And it's like, yeah, sand is actually pretty shallow to the bedrock, and they removed the sand and then built a lumber foundation and then built the fort on top of that. So there's some condescension in his video as well. I just wanted to make that clear. So not saying that I'm a saint or perfect, but just saying that he's not in a position to talk. So with the criticisms from my last video and my explanation for how I feel about them out of the way, let's actually get into the definition of Tartaria and how Mind Unveiled seems to argue that history works. So according to Mind Unveiled on their channel, I've realized this is actually two people now, but according to their channel, this is the largest conspiracy, that's his word by the way, conspiracy in the world, perhaps even larger than Flat Earth, which by the way, his Reddit suggests he believes in as well. And he claims that this whole theory begins with all of our taught history being a lie. Now, there's an immediate problem here, which is that history at the professional level is not taught, it is studied. We take documents, artifacts, we talk with anthropologists and archaeologists, linguists, geneticists, all sorts of different groups, and the goal is to, using the evidence available, construct a coherent narrative for what happened in history. And I'm not saying fake a narrative, I'm saying actually present what we believe happened, based on the available evidence. So it's studied in that historians ask a question, gather evidence, take notes, analyze, discuss, publish their work, and then it is reviewed by other historians. So in no way is it that at the professional level, historians are just reading a textbook. And then we've got to address his definition for Tartaria, because it's not what you might expect. When you hear somebody say Tartaria, you might think that they're talking about a specific landmass and its history. The term, according to Mind Unveiled, is a little bit more broad than that. And it goes as follows. The phenomena or category of alternative history that delves into the research of lost history and civilizations, hijacks and stolen buildings, magic, alchemy, and cloning, antiquitech, cataclysms, mudfloods, buried buildings, star forts and fortified cities, royal bloodlines and secret brotherhoods, asylums, orphans and oddfellows, underground tunnels and waste management, and suppressed Moorish history. Mind Unveiled, I will give him credit, he does say that there are surely some truths sprinkled in, and I would argue that there's more than some, and he very, very much overestimates the lies. Additionally, I find it very interesting that this is all constructed around the Catholic Church lying to people, and yet he never once mentions the donation of Constantine, which is probably the most famous lie ever told by the Catholic Church. We'll get to the exact details of what the donation of Constantine was and what it was used for later, but it's very odd that something so obvious was not mentioned. And it's odd that it wasn't mentioned despite the fact that it's in Sarian's book. Like, I bought it. I bought actually all of the books that he uses here. But let's start with the fabricated history and stolen cities. And I will say at times this does kind of veer out of the original topic that I chose, because the way that his video works, it doesn't always remain on the exact topic. But he says what Tartaria boils down to is fabricated history and stolen cities. And then he suggests that New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Charleston, Tampa, all of these different major US cities were all actually built by the Tartarians and were already here when the European colonists arrived. He's claiming that these buildings are being recycled, that they were already there and dug out of the mud after the mud flood, which, yes, we'll get to the mud flood too. Now, as far as the actual building examples he gives for talking about this, we did cover that in the last video. So on screen right now, you should see the photos from the last video that we were talking about. All of these have perfectly reasonable explanations. Nobody was digging a building out of the ground. At about 3 minutes 11 seconds in this video, however, he shows us the Rua del Setembro in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And once again, he uses a very blurry, low-resolution version of the image, despite the fact that high-resolution ones are very, very, very much available on the internet. This is something he actually does on numerous occasions throughout the videos. He shows a very, very low-quality image and suggests that, that's the only version we have. In the photo, he has what appears to be a utility pole circled in red, as well as the spire from an adjacent building across the street. And looking at it, it does look like there's no wires attached to the utility pole, but that's just because of the quality of the photography. We're going to be talking about a photo later in this very video where it's taken a little bit closer to the utility pole and you can see the lines, but they're very faint. So it's very possible that the reason there's no lines attached to that utility pole is just that the camera wasn't of a high enough quality to capture it. But because there are no wires, he claims that it is collecting atmospheric energy. At 3:35, he shows a photo that the website Piercing the Veil of Illusion has labeled as Charlotte, North Carolina, and it's being excavated. This is a problem because the picture is actually of Marseille, France. It was taken by an Adolphe Theory during expansions and renovations of the city in 1863, and I was told I don't do my own research. But this photograph is not of North Carolina. It's not even in America. It is France. Do you know how much pain I'm in having to use France for my argument? Next, he shows us the Oriental Hotel in Dunedin, which is in New Zealand, not the United States. Just from looking at the picture, it's pretty clear that what happened was they dug into the hillside to build this building, and that it was not dug out of the mud. This is partially because it was a lumber structure that actually caught on fire 4 different times before they finally decided to demolish it because it was a fire hazard that could have burned down the entire town. According to Mind Unveiled, all of this old world architecture seems to be made out of stone. And as I said, it was only standing for like 20 years. It was built in 1863 and demolished in 1887. But then we move on to an example that's not just a background photo, it's something he actually talks about. And that, of course, is Tampa Bay, or the city of Tampa. The first thing he mentions is that there are tunnels underneath most major US cities, and in this case we're talking specifically about the Ybor Tunnel underneath Tampa. Now, those tunnels aren't really that much of a mystery to historians, as he claims that they are, and he says that historians claim they were prohibition tunnels meant to smuggle alcohol, but the article he has on screen as support for this entire thing very, very clearly says that historians think they were sewers. Now, in that article, it does say that it's entirely possible that people did use these tunnels to smuggle alcohol, but it seems pretty clear that these were sewer tunnels. So his whole mainstream historians are all lying to you thing doesn't really work here because mainstream historians aren't saying the things he's claiming they are. And according to the article, those tunnels were built in the 1880s, and if they were built in the 1880s, it makes complete sense that they would have been new sewers, because we were just starting to build industrial urban sewers at that time. Additionally, newer pipes are down there that were installed as late as the 70s or 80s. So, either the city misplaced records about the construction of the tunnels, or Tartaria was still in existence well into Reagan's presidency. That's what it was. Reagan destroyed Tartaria. He goes on to say that some of these tunnels are massive and couldn't be built using the technology of the time, but he does not go on to explain what that means or why they couldn't be built using the technology of the time. He does use an image of the Union Canal Tunnel, which is not that far from us, over in, just central Pennsylvania, and it's really not all that impressive up close. They basically dug a ditch and then dug some tunnels through hills and mountains. That's it. It's nothing too impressive. Also, the rock that they had to dig through to make this tunnel was primarily slate, which breaks extraordinarily easily and was also very popular as roofing shingles. So this would have been a dual-purpose project where you would have both the roofing shingles coming out of it, other things slate could be used for, like tiles and countertops, and then on top of that, you were also building a canal to connect the Susquehanna to the Schuylkill. The next example is the Washington Street Tunnel in Chicago. I will bring it up how quickly we got off of Tampa. And naturally, we get a picture of some lines in the sky with a red circle around it and no context whatsoever. And then I reversed image searched it with both TinEye and Google Lens, and interestingly enough, this is definitely a doctored image. In fact, if you just look at it, it's very clearly a doctored image. The clouds in the sky appear to have been photoshopped in, as well as the lines that are clearly from a utility pole. And it's weird that he did this, because the previous image is taken from almost exactly the same angle, and shows no signs of being doctored, and also has buildings in it that are not present in the one that he shows that's doctored. If you look at it, it's very clear that some of these buildings were photoshopped in, that somebody just used the paintbrush removing tool to get rid of one building and didn't even do a very good job of it, and you can see the utility poles that were photoshopped from the previous picture. So it's very obviously a fake image, and the one right before it isn't, and is different. It's just, I don't understand. And as I got to this point in my research, I really genuinely could not tell if I felt like this was just deliberate deception or not. The next claim is that there's also a tunnel system under Pensacola, Florida, and that this is being suppressed from the history books because they don't line up with the official PR-approved narratives. He then moves on to claim that there is a massive tunnel system under Pensacola, Florida, and his evidence for this appears to be an article written in a magazine that I was not able to find. But here's how this goes. There is a legend that when the Spanish left Pensacola, they had secret tunnels under the city and they didn't tell anybody where they were. A Mike Henderson, writing for the aforementioned unnamed magazine, claims that he had been inside and that the entrance was at Fort Barrancas, and claims that they lead all the way downtown. Of course, he has never actually gone through them all the way downtown. He was just sure that they led there. Additionally, the tunnels under Fort Barrancas are on TripAdvisor. He also claims as evidence that the nearby Naval Air Station, which has some of these old tunnels under it, has signs that say danger, restricted area, and those signs are placed just before the entrances to 236-year-old unmaintained tunnels. So clearly there's a conspiracy here. But now we're finally actually back to Tampa Bay, but it's not to talk about tunnels, it's to talk about the Tampa Bay Hotel, built by Henry B. Plant. Of course, it is now the Henry B. Plant Museum, and that building was constructed from 1888 1898 to 1891 as part of Plant's ambitions to dominate the Florida railroad and shipping market. He was, of course, a railroad and steamship magnate, and he had just built a rail line all the way down to Florida. He himself was from New York. And along that rail line, to encourage people to travel on it and use the passenger trains and make him money, he planted a whole bunch of hotels, one of which was the Tampa Bay Hotel. And it's pretty well known in the area that Henry B. Plant is responsible for much of the industrialization of that part of Florida. And Plant's activities were well documented during his life. It's not like this is something that was kind of just written onto a blog or into a textbook later. In fact, we've got articles discussing his business in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle on the 10th of July, 1890, in the St. Louis Globe-Democrat on the 6th of March, 1892, and in the Philadelphia Inquirer on the 8th of October, 1885, as well as many, many, many other mentions of Henry B. Plant. Mind Unveiled goes on to claim that this building is actually Old World architecture built by the Tartarians, and this is because of the Moorish exterior, Moorish revival, really, and the European interior. Now, primary sources from the era that would be, photographs, documents, magazines, newspapers, architectural plans, all sorts of things, all will tell you that back in the late 1800s, what was fashionable in Europe was fashionable in the United States. This was actually basically the case all the way up until World War I. Much of American style, what Americans considered to be the upper class, the upper echelon of life, was taken from Europe. But of course, Mind Unveiled is saying that he doubts this video was built at the time it was claimed, that it's actually Tartarian architecture. He goes on to say, most of the time you'll get a few construction photos, but it's fascinating to find out how poorly documented the construction process was during this time. At this point in the video, he has on screen a very blurry image of the construction of the Tampa Bay Hotel with scaffolding and all of that he claims shows it completely built, and there's text on screen. I'll have the picture up on screen. There's text on screen that says that, why is this the most high quality image available when we have HD ones, when we should have the HD capabilities? Well, it's not the highest quality one that you can find. In fact, if you go to the very website he's talking about, the photograph is there and you can blow it up into full HD, full screen resolution, and you can actually tell when looking at the full HD version that yes, half of the building has not even reached the full height yet, that it is very much being built, and there are people in the photograph. You can tell that the construction process was ongoing. So either he didn't look or he's lying. He also mentions what he calls vanilla skies in the background of the photo, the not detailed, kind of just off-white sky. The entire photo is in sepia, and it was 1880s photography. And he also mentions that there are a lot of these early cityscape photos that don't show anybody in them. Why do we have these empty cities? We must have just dug them out of the ground and then populated them later. We'll get to that. But the thing is, when you're trying to get a detailed image of a cityscape on an archaic camera, you're gonna have to have a very long exposure time. And the thing is, people don't really stay in place all that long. So they simply won't show up. The camera will not register due to the old technology, the fact that there were in fact people on the street, because they moved too fast for the camera to capture them. We can see this in a lot of old photographs where things that are taken at a little bit more of a tight angle, you can see that somebody will be walking and they're perfectly represented, but somebody else will be running and that person will be blurry. Now, of course, he does mention other clear signs of photo manipulation, but says that that's an entirely different video to avoid, explaining what he means. And very ironically, he actually shows a number of very obviously doctored photos in support of his theory throughout the entire video. He's also very fond of presenting information, questioning its legitimacy, and then just giving reasons why it might be incorrect before moving on, but he never actually makes a point. He never discusses any evidence. He's just like, do you really believe this? And yeah. He does this with the Ponce de Leon Hotel in Tampa, and it's the one it's the first building in the United States to be made entirely of poured concrete. And I would show you the clip and the context, but several other creators who have engaged with Mind Unveiled in the past reached out to me to tell me that if I used any of his clips, he'd probably copyright strike me. So I will not be doing that. I'll just timestamp where you can go watch the context. He also notes that these hotels were built with full electricity installed, which is weird because there wasn't much going on in Florida at the time, so we're told. Of course, this is not remotely true, and the idea that people didn't plan cities and didn't actually actively encourage people to move there in the 1800s is wild to me. Like, that's a well-known fact. And as we know, Henry B. Plant, since the 1880s, had been pushing for people to move to Florida, to industrialize Florida, so he could make money on his rail lines and his steamships. And of course, Henry B. Plant was not the only one. There were other people who were at the same level as him, doing the same thing all over the United States. We'll actually end up talking about one, Charles Broadwater. And I do need to reiterate that this entire theory is predicated upon the belief that all of these images, these buildings, everything about this old world architecture, that it can't be explained. And the problem with that is there's an explanation for every building, and there's actually evidence for most of them. It's not just, hey, this is what they said it happened, this is how they said it was built. It's like we have photos of construction, or we have newspaper documents talking about it. Like, you need a subscription to newspapers.com, but I have one because I do this for a living. You don't solve the boy in the box case without a newspapers.com subscription, Maybe I can use my newspapers.com subscription to read the Philadelphia Inquirer article that doesn't credit us with discovering the identity of the boy in the box's parents 2 weeks before they've read their article. That's cool. His next point is all of the Russian and Turkic style architecture in the United States. Now, this would be a very interesting point if he didn't also call neoclassical, Second Empire, neocolonial, Gothic Revival, and basically any other 1800s architecture style Tartarian, despite the fact that there is very little, if anything, in common between Moorish architecture and neoclassical. Can also be partially explained by the fact that the global East was starting to join the industrialized world, and so you were getting a lot more influence from countries that previously didn't have much of a say in American events or in culture, history, style, places that were still behind the times in terms of technology, and so just weren't really putting their own culture out as much. It can also be explained partially by the fact that America is a nation of immigrants. One example he gives is the Moorish revival style architecture, the Moorish influenced architecture of the city of Opelika, Florida. It might be Opelika. I've given up with Florida. Today that city is within the urban sprawl of Miami and Fort Lauderdale, how that's just kind of one big coastal city, but it does maintain its own municipal government. The city itself was actually designed by Glenn Curtiss of the Curtiss Aircraft Manufacturing Company in 1926. This was during the Florida land boom, when all of the work that Henry B. Plant and people like him had done in the 1880s and 90s was dragging a whole lot of people to Florida because suddenly there was stuff there. Now, Mind Unveiled suggests that this architecture is actually considerably older and built by the Tartarians. There's a few problems with that. We have photography of the Miami area before Opelika was built, and it is not there. And Opelika differs considerably from the other buildings from Tampa Bay that he shows when you look at them side by side. The Henry B. Plant Museum, what was once the Tampa Bay Hotel, looks very different from the City Hall of Opelika. But most importantly, it should be mentioned that the University of Miami has a document with before and after pictures showing the construction of Opelika, Florida, right there on its website. Like, it took me a single Google search to find it. It's got construction photos, plans, articles about it being built, the whole 9 yards. It's not just the one document with the before and after photos, it's a bunch of documents. He also asks if you've ever wondered why it's called St. Petersburg, Florida, but does not ask the same question about Syracuse, New York, or Suffolk, Connecticut, or really any other American city named after a European city. Look, I'm not saying that it's necessarily a bad argument, I'm just saying that if you're gonna argue based on place names, be consistent. Now, he does go on to mention other cities, but he's not focusing on their names, he's focusing on their architecture. Which, again, I must remind everybody that Moorish architecture and Russian architecture are not the same thing, and the ones he brings up also aren't Russian or even necessarily consistently Moorish. The first one he shows is Central Synagogue, which is in Manhattan, and it features a Moorish Revival exterior with a more European-style interior, specifically a neo-Gothic. And before anybody points out that I'm just saying what Wikipedia says, I have a medieval studies degree. I know what neo-Gothic architecture looks like. I didn't need to look that up. But when I did have legitimate questions about the architecture style of a certain building, I called up my buddy, who's a architecture master's student at Columbia. So that's my source. Guy's getting his master's of architecture. And again, this is not a Russian-style building, and he keeps acting like the Russians and the Moors are interchangeable. They're not. They're very different cultures. Next, we get Islam Temple, which is not a Muslim temple at all, but rather a Shriners Temple, which was built in 1917. Now, the Shriners are a part of an appendant body of Freemasonry, which means that you have to be a Master Mason to join, but not all Masons are Shriners, nor do all Masons share the beliefs or mission of the Shriners. Now, if you are one of the people out there who has convinced yourself that the Freemasons are all evil Satanists, this probably won't change your mind, but I know a bunch of Shriners, and they give up their weekends to go and entertain kids at children's hospitals. Like, they dress up like clowns and play with toys with them. It's actually really heartwarming and wholesome. Shriners' hospitals also provide care at as low a cost as possible, even free in some circumstances. And just to lay it out there, I am not a Shriner. Now, as far as evidence that it's not older than 1917 goes, an article in The Architect and Engineer of California, dated to September of 1917, a J.F. Dunn writes, "In the new shrine temple being created on Geary Street, San Francisco, is found a rare example of a building designed in a historical style." Now, another document about a similar temple by the same name is available online, but to be very clear, that one's in Sacramento, not San Francisco. And I'll give it to him that I couldn't find any photos of its construction, but it was just one of many buildings being built in San Francisco that year, so it's not too surprising there's no photos. And as I said, there is contemporary documentation that the building was not yet completed, so. And also, just to be perfectly clear, I'm not getting all of this from like articles that were written in the last 20 years. I'm going back and I am finding the scans of the original documents that were written in 1917, that were written in 1885. So I'm looking at the actual document, not somebody transcribing it into something else. I think it's also a good time to mention photography and its evolution, because a lot of the buildings that he brings up were constructed when only daguerreotype photography was available. Now, daguerreotype photography, the gist of it is it works differently. You're basically etching the image onto a silver plate, which is not the same way that modern photography or the photography that developed after 1854 worked. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that I totally understand it, but I'll remember to leave the link to how this works in the description. But the thing about daguerreotypes was that they were difficult to reproduce. Either an artist had to copy it, a photorealistic artist, or you had to take yet another daguerreotype of your daguerreotype. So there aren't a lot of copies. Now, the practice of using cameras that captured on negatives and were then copied to get you the positive, that didn't really come about until after 1854. In fact, it was absolutely not available to the public before 1854. Now, the newer kind of photography were not as precisely detailed as the daguerreotype was, but they were easier to reproduce, considerably. The next example we get is the Farmers and Exchange Bank in Charleston, South Carolina. Because it was constructed before 1854, any photographs of it are likely daguerreotypes, and therefore copies are hard to come by, so I couldn't find any photos of its construction. Also, given how old the city of Charleston is, you can't find photographs of Charleston before there were buildings there. And the area in which that specific building was built is one of the earlier populated areas of Charleston. And he also hits us with the Inad Shriners Temple, which is in East St. Louis, Illinois. But the thing is, if you go on their website, there are photos of it being constructed. You can also find other photos of it being constructed. It's very clearly not old world architecture, as he claims. The next example we get is that he claims that old world churches, and I think he's talking about Romanesque and Gothic revival here, that most of the examples he shows are one of those two things when it comes to churches. But he says they have questionable history as being rebuilt or moved multiple times. He directs us to Sacred Heart Catholic Church, which was actually built twice, but for a very good reason. According to the church itself, and on their website, a small church was built there in Tampa, Florida in 1859, and that church served the entire Catholic community of Tampa. But as Plant's railroad and steamships led to more and more growth in the region, they had to build a newer, bigger church to accommodate more and more Catholics. Now, a photo of the construction can be found, but it is pretty obvious that it was touched up by an artist because it seems like it wasn't very high quality to begin with. So I'm not going to use that as an example simply because he'll just say that it's clearly touched up. But this one can actually be debunked entirely on stylistic grounds, because he's made it pretty clear that Moorish Revival and Russian-style architecture, those are the Tartarian buildings. Those are evidence of Tartaria. This is Romanesque Revival. It's not even Romanesque, it is Romanesque Revival. So it can't be Tartarian because it's not a Tartarian architecture style, it's a revival style of a European architecture style from a time period he says didn't happen. There's probably no way I'm getting through this video without being condescending. Guys, I tried. We're 11 pages of notes into this and I've got 37 more. Next up, we have Cornelius Vanderbilt II's Manhattan Mansion, which was constructed in 1883 at 57th and 5th Avenue. Now, there are no photos that I could find of the construction of the building. I did find photos of its demolition, which the demolition shows the wooden frame pretty clearly, but whatever. The point is, there are photos of that block in 1870. And there is not a mansion there in 1870. In fact, there's several blocks with no permanent buildings at all constructed yet. Now, the photo currently on your screen was taken at 55th and Madison, just a couple blocks over, but you can clearly see the corner of 57th and 5th in the photograph, and there is no mansion there. It's on the far left side. And remember how I gave you timestamps earlier in the video for how far along into his I was? The first one I mentioned was 3 minutes 11 seconds. Look where we are in the video now. The length of this video, I'm just hitting what's on screen at 6:38 in his. Now, the photo that was on screen at 6:38 was a picture of Market Street in Chattanooga, Tennessee. It was taken in 1907, and this is the one that I said you can see the wires on the utility poles, but they're faint, and that's why the one from Rio de Janeiro, you probably can't see the wires just because the camera didn't pick them up, because that picture was taken between 3 and 10 years later, so. And if you look at the distance from the camera to the utility pole in the picture taken in the 1910s versus the one taken in 1907, that was weird. The light just flickered. Anyway, if you look at those two, the Rio one is definitely further away from the utility pole, and the wires are already faint in the Chattanooga one. It's also a good example of how exposure time affects photography from the late 1800s and early 1900s, because as you can see in the foreground, there is a woman walking and she's pretty clear, but there's also in the middle of the picture a boy running and he is very much not clear. So even as late as 1907, if somebody was running, they were going to be blurry. And this isn't like an Olympic track star running, this is like a kid jogging down the street who's blurry. Next up is the Manhattan Talmudical Academy, which goes by several names, but that was the easiest one to use. And I'll admit that I can't find pre-construction photos of it, and I also couldn't find photos of it being built. But it was founded in 1916, and photos of the Washington Heights neighborhood where the Talmudical Academy is, taken back in the late 1800s, show it as being not a city block, but much more isolated mansions on large estates. So I couldn't find any pictures that necessarily prove that this building was built in 1916, but based on what Washington Heights was like 30 years prior, it seems unlikely that anything was there. We have pictures of the mansions and these estates, these rolling hills. I would argue that you would see more, if that area had already been developed to the extent they're claiming, you would have seen more construction there. Next up is Eastern State Penitentiary, which is right in Philadelphia, 40 minutes down the road. Now, this prison may look like a castle, and that was a deliberate decision made by the architect to make it more imposing, to suggest to criminals that perhaps they don't do crime so they don't end up in the scary dungeon. It was built from 1821 to 1829, so entirely before photography even existed in the United States. I believe in 1829, photography was like a novel, brand new thing in France. Now, it is clearly, looking at the building, looking at the plans, being inside of it, that building was obviously built as a prison and nothing else. But more importantly, when it was built, it had flushing toilets integrated in 1829, which is actually pretty impressive. But that's important because Mind Unveiled claims that the Tartarians did not need to eat food. They did not need toilets because they didn't need to eat food, and that's why there's no toilets in American cities before the 1880s. And he claims that they survived on air somehow, and he calls them breatharians. I didn't even bother with that one, I'm gonna be honest. Because what? At this point, the Tartarians aren't even human anymore. They're something else, because our metabolisms need calories. There's physically no way that we could survive without calories, breathing air. That's not, no. And I know there is a chance he takes this and he goes, Aiden didn't look into da-da-da. I'm not wasting time on breatharianism. That's not gonna happen. You will not get me there. Then he shows us an image that is clearly from a postcard, which shows a hospital labeled somewhere in Worcester, Massachusetts. I couldn't find it. It's actually very easy to find St. Vincent Hospital in Massachusetts. That's really easy to do. But for some reason, he chose the blurriest possible version of the photo on the internet. And this point in my notes is where I began to feel like he's probably grifting. I know I said that this was a video about Tartaria, but given the scope of the personal attacks he and his followers have levied against me, I'm just gonna make that point. It was built as a small 12-bed Catholic hospital that was just serving the Worcester area, and it was built on Vernon Hill, or in Vernon Hill. I'll be honest, I didn't look to check if that was a Hamlet or what. And it was built in 1893, so the fact that it was that small kind of explains why there's no construction photos of it. It just wasn't a big deal. It also seems possible that the building was not built for the hospital and existed under some other name before that, and I couldn't find any records. It's just one of those things that, like, okay, I guess I'll give it to you that this one doesn't have photographs of it being constructed. But the style is decidedly not old world, and it's actually such a weird style that when I called up my architecture buddy, we both looked at this thing for 15 minutes and neither of us could figure it out because it mixes so many different ones. It's arguably colonial revival mixed with neoclassical and Victorian elements. He then shows us the Army-Navy Hospital in Hot Springs, Arkansas, which is clearly constructed of wood and not in Moorish or Russian or neoclassical or really any of the architecture styles that he has nailed down as being Tartarian. Now, full disclosure, couldn't find pictures of it being built. I'll be honest. I'll be fair. And I also couldn't find pictures of the location prior to the Army Hospital being there. So, you know what? If you want to take this one, I'll give you the victory lap on that. But then it's on to Broadwater Natatorium in Helena, Montana, which was established in 1889 by Charles Broadwater, who, much like Henry Plant, was in charge of a railroad. The rather massive structure would look out of place today if it was still standing, but back in the day, Helena was a pretty major gold rush town, and the natatorium actually had water supplied to it by 1.5 miles of redwood piping that took water from springs up in the mountains down into the natatorium, which is, we used redwoods as pipes.
Really?
Yeah. I will be honest, I learned doing this research that we used to make pipes out of redwood. Now, while the construction of the building isn't particularly well documented, the architect is, because he was the state architect for Montana and actually ended up getting involved in a scandal for accepting bribes. And while I could not find pictures of the building's construction, I was able to find pictures of Helena in 1870, and there is no natatorium there. And there's also zero evidence whatsoever that the photos were doctored. And if you're wondering, why did Helena, Montana and a bunch of gold miners need a giant natatorium? Well, it's because during the gold rush, about 50 millionaires lived in Helena. That was the most millionaires living anywhere in the US in one space. Now, of course, $1 million was a lot more money back then, so it would be less impressive today, but the building eventually changed hands, Charles Broadwater died, fell into a period of disuse, and then it got to the point where it was so decrepit that they could only really tear it down, and they did that back in 1974. And I feel like at this point I have made my point, but he does go on to show several more photos of buildings that do have backstories and evidence for their construction, just like all of these ones did. But he says that there's no proof that they were built in the fashion they tell us, other than state-approved documents, manipulated photos, and just complete lies. Now, he provides no evidence that any of these documents were at any point state-approved in some sort of legitimate process. We've actually caught him using manipulated photos and lowering the resolution of other photos to make them seem more mysterious, and he downright lied about the Tampa Bay Hotel having no pictures of its construction, and about the quality of the pictures. So as far as old world architecture, stolen cities, all that goes, I think I've made my point that none of these are actually mysterious when you look into their backgrounds. Requires that you actually do look into their backgrounds though. So I guess what you could say is it's only really a mystery if either you don't do any research or if you're misleading people for the ad revenue. So let's move on to the next subject at hand, because we just finished covering that one, which is buried cities. We're told of a common theme in downtown America of buildings with entire floors below street level. These have windows, doors, these were clearly at street level at one point in history. So to support this, he shows us pictures of mud-flooded windows, and then as an example, gives us a picture of Kansas City that we debunked in the last video. Now, as far as the explanation for these entire stories that are below street level, which, to be fair, in many cases actually were at street level at one point and became basements later, he does claim that the mainstream narrative is that, oh, well, they're just basements. Of course, that's not true at all. In some cases, they are just basements. In other cases, we have records of the streets being raised. As I said, the hills had to be excavated as Kansas City expanded. The Seattle Underground was created after a fire destroyed 66 blocks of the city, and they just took the opportunity to raise the grade of the streets because the area had a flooding problem anyway. I also need to point out that this has happened in cities all over Europe as well, so pointing to Tartaria for this doesn't make any sense. Where was Tartaria? And as far as getting stuff buried under the mud, like where'd all this mud come from? There are a couple of different answers if you ask the Tartaria community. The most typical one I've gotten, well, I shouldn't say most typical, but one of the ones I've gotten is that the Antiquitech, the technology of the Tartarians, it caused soil liquefaction and entire cities just kind of sank a couple meters. Mind Unveiled suggests mud volcanoes. Now, soil liquefaction of this scale would likely cause buildings to collapse, not just sink. It is possible that a building could remain intact, but these kinds of buildings, that scale of soil liquefaction, they're probably gonna fall over. And then as for Mind Unveiled's version, which is of course the mud volcanoes, that's not something that just disappears. We know where the mud volcanoes in the United States are. We have them tracked. We can pretty much debunk the whole mud flood thing, the whole, at least the mud volcano thing, with the point that there is not one near Seattle at all, and none of the ones in the United States are remotely large enough to bury a city. You can actually see some in Yellowstone. One of his supporting arguments for this mud flood thing is St. Mary Magdalene Church in Omaha, Nebraska, which of course we discussed in the last video. We completely debunked this. They regraded the streets down considerably to flatten some hills so that they could expand the city westward. And the result was that St. Mary Magdalene Church, which was built on a hill, as they regraded, they had to build a new foundation for the church under it. So what he is claiming is the church being dug out of the mud, when you look at the pictures, is very clearly them digging out the hillside under the church and building the new foundation. He notes underground windows and doors that lead to nowhere, but in many cases, what he's showing are very legitimately just basements that have windows to let in light, because these were built before electric lighting in many cases. And then also, sometimes he does show them, but these ones are the result of street raising projects. And no, I'm not just gonna say, oh, these are just the result of street raising projects, we don't need to go any further into it, because when I said that in the last video and basically implied that you could find the evidence pretty easily yourself, a lot of his supporters and he himself said I provided no evidence. So now I'm gonna go point by point through the evidence of his examples and how we know that they were not created by mud flood volcanoes. I mean, first up, we've been talking about America this whole time, and the first image he shows naturally is of the Russian Polytechnic Institute in Moscow. Now what he's showing in that image is the restoration of that building. Back in the 2010s, the Russian government decided that it had kind of fallen into disrepair, and they wanted it to look nicer again. So they hired a British company called Event Communications, and they got to work basically organizing how they were gonna make this building look nicer. It's a beautiful building, by the way. The building was opened in its first phase, which was originally just what is now the central portion of the building, and that was in 1872, and then 2 wings were added later as the museum expanded. I was able to determine that the image shown in the video is the northwest facade of the building, to be clear, and the photograph is from the 2010s, but here's the thing about the northwest facade and why it can't possibly be buried Tartarian architecture. It's because the northwest facade was not built yet. The first photograph I could find, the earliest I could find of this building, was from 1884, and neither of the wings are there yet. So they can't be digging Tartarian architecture out of the mud if the architecture wasn't there in the first place. He moves us on to the fact that many American towns and cities have underground cities which make no sense. He asks, and I quote, "Did they just do a bunch of extra work for nothing? Put windows and doors and streets down there for the heck of it?" And he asks this while an article explaining why this exists in Seattle is literally on screen. Now, I would go into that article, but we also just explained Seattle. He moves on to show us Chattanooga, where the streets were raised between 1875 and 1905 to handle flooding issues. The article he pulls up on screen, which implies that this is a complete mystery and nobody knows why these streets were raised, is from Atlas Obscura, which I will admit has some pretty well-written stuff, but it's not the most reliable source when it comes to, really doing research on this kind of thing. So while it's fair to say that evidence of the streets being raised is hard to come by, that's different from saying there's no evidence and no explanation for why the streets were raised. For example, the Memphis Daily Appeal on the 24th of March, 1867, notes extensive damage caused by flooding in Chattanooga, and on March 15th, the Louisville Daily Courier says the same thing. And the latter article from the Louisville Daily Courier, that one mentions that the water level rose at least 2 stories. A March 4th, 1875 article in the Chattanooga Daily Times records a meeting to discuss a solution to the flooding. The article includes a suggestion that they raise the streets just like Chicago recently had, and that was a more permanent, more long-term, and cheaper solution than a levee that would have to be replaced and repaired constantly. A letter to the editor in the same issue of that newspaper suggests taking dirt from Cameron Hill and using it to raise Market, Chestnut, and Railroad avenues, as well as Poplar and Chestnut streets. He argues that this would open Cameron Hill for development as well as solve the flooding issue, and therefore would be a net positive. And yet another piece in that same issue of the Chattanooga Daily Times mentions that streets in Chattanooga have been raised before to deal with flooding without any issue. An article in that same paper dated July 7th, 1875, notes that Market Street's grade has not yet been adjusted. A November 18th article from the same year does note and does remind people that Mayor James is responsible for the unauthorized raising of the Market Street grade. Further articles go on to discuss raising more streets, including an April 19th, 1886 one in which it was petitioned that the city raise all streets above the high water mark of 1875. So, clearly we have records of why the streets were raised, and it was not a mud flood, it was a river flood. He also shows Kansas City's underground as an example, but that's not even what he's suggesting it is, because it's not, underground streets. It was a converted mine and storage space that became commercial space. And I want to take us back to the question he asked, which was, did they just do a bunch of extra work for nothing? Put windows and doors and streets down there for the heck of it? This question is important because his claim that there were lower levels of the cities in America which have been built over is correct. His reasoning, however, is demonstrably incorrect. He also says that there are massive tunnel systems under most US major cities, and that this alone should be reasoned question. He says this despite the fact that we do have evidence and explanations for many of these tunnel systems, including the ones he shows, and one of the pictures he uses in this whole thing is a stock photo of a mine shaft from a listicle. In fact, in this specific segment, the only example of a tunnel given is the mine shaft, which again, rural mine shaft, stock photo, listicle. Sewers come up next, with Mind Unveiled claiming that we did not have proper waste management until the year 1900. Now, on screen it says the 19th century, so I don't know who messed up there. He claims that people were defecating in chamber pots into the 1850s and just throwing them out the window into the streets. Now, it is true that people were still using chamber pots in the 1850s, but it was very much illegal to throw your waste out the window. That doesn't mean people didn't do it. They did, but that wasn't the preferred method. It was also not the legal method for how to dispose of waste. Additionally, most homes being built in the 1800s had privies in them or even flushing toilets. For those that don't know what a privy is, it's basically a bathroom, but instead of a flushing toilet that goes into the sewage system, it's usually drops into a sewer below that ends up getting flushed. And in other cases, particularly in rural areas, you might have an outhouse, which was kind of the same idea, a latrine, where you dug a hole in the ground, filled it up with, ash, and that was your toilet. Or they might have a cesspit, which would be you use a chamber pot or something along those lines, and you throw it into a cesspit. And in rural areas, that was pretty common because human waste, much like animal waste, makes great fertilizer. I think a lot of people don't quite grasp that aspect of a lot of these things about history, is that we didn't used to have specialties for every single thing. You made the most use out of everything that you possibly could. Many projects, many skills, many activities, things that people did for productive reasons often had dual purposes. Now, of course, as industrialized cities grew and it was harder and harder to stop people from doing things like throwing their waste into the streets, you started to see epidemics like cholera. But here's the thing about cholera. It wasn't necessarily people dumping waste out the window that caused the cholera epidemics. It was waste in cesspits and dung heaps seeping into the groundwater and into the drinking water of the cities of London and New York and Philadelphia, places that had huge populations, and the infrastructure wasn't really there for a population that large. So what you had was people didn't understand germ theory. They still thought that disease spread through odors, and you had dung, you had waste that seeped into the groundwater, it got into the wells, people drank from the wells, and then you got sick. It's important to mention here that cholera is actually what led to the development of modern sewer systems as well as germ theory, because it was realized that, hey, human waste ain't exactly good for you, and also there's tiny animals in it, and they want to kill you. They actually don't want to kill you. It's not on purpose most of the time. Viruses, though. He goes on to say what you have is this complete contradiction with the cultures, technology, and population counts needed to create these cities and buildings on this magnitude and scale in such a short time frame. He says they were building structures in just a few years that were taking hundreds of years in Europe. Now, he does not give examples of the buildings that were taking hundreds of years in Europe, but I can only imagine he's talking about cathedrals. There's basically nothing else that ever took hundreds of years to build in Europe. Castles might take a couple decades, but now the thing is, cathedral building tapered off in the 1500s as it just became less popular. And also, the first American building he shows as an example is the Philadelphia City Hall. I should probably point out that City Hall broke ground in 1871 and was completed in 1901. That is 30 years. That is multiple decades. That is not a few years compared to a cathedral taking several hundred. Additionally, there are photos of the construction of Philadelphia City Hall, like a number of them, including pictures that show the ground before it was there as the site of City Hall, and then also pictures of people building City Hall. Also, City Hall is Second Empire style architecture, which is not Russian or Moorish, even in the slightest. Additionally, in Mind Unveiled's chronology, the Middle Ages did not happen. So basically 400 to 1400 didn't happen, right? The Notre Dame was completed in the 1300s, which means that there is, even in his chronology, that means that the latest it could have actually been built was 1400. There's still about 500 years between these two buildings being completed. It's not the same technology, it's not the same materials, it's not the same culture, it's not the same time frame. And I should also probably bring up that if the Middle Ages didn't happen, how do we know it took hundreds of years to build the cathedrals that were built in the Middle Ages, if all of that's faked? The next example he gives is St. Thomas Catholic Church in Manhattan, and this is the third St. Thomas Church to bear that name and serve that congregation. There's actually another one now because this one burned down. It was constructed from 1865 to 1870, and it's not cathedral-sized. Or at least it wasn't. So first of all, I want to point out, in terms of the culture and technology point, the first skyscraper was built in Chicago just 15 years later. And yes, there's photos of that skyscraper being built. Now, there are no readily available construction photos of St. Thomas Church, but like I said, the church burned down in 1905, and most likely any records they had, any pictures of it being built, would have been stored there. So any records were probably just destroyed. There are, however, paintings of the first St. Thomas Church, which was built in the 1700s, and it looks different. But no, I wasn't going to stop there and just give you the logical explanation. No, I have to go deeper because I know he will take this out of context if he can. I have to point out to you that there are mentions of this building being built in the newspaper during the time it's being built. The August 2nd, 1865 issue of the Brooklyn Union reported on the sale of the old property and the likely neighborhood location of the new one. The New York Times issue of the same day corroborates this, adding that a new site had not been selected yet. An article in the New York Daily Herald, this one from the April 21st, 1867 issue, notes a service at the temporary chapel of St. Thomas Church, located at 53rd and 5th. If there was already a church standing there, why did they need a temporary chapel? An article from the New York Times in 1870 notes that the interior of St. Thomas Church had been completed. If it were already there, why is there a New York Times article saying the interior had just been completed in 1870? And also, it's just abundantly clear that no research has been done by Mind Unveiled into the different architectural styles of American construction. Like, there have been numerous well-documented Old World revival styles, including Gothic, Moorish, Romanesque, all of those. But he comes back to remind us of the topic at hand, right? Which is, many of the downtowns in America have old world buildings that do not have an in-depth historical record. We've just gone example by example to show you that he cannot back this claim and that there is significant evidence against it. Many of the examples he gave were in conflicting styles, most had evidence that they were in fact constructed when and how they claimed, and he used a doctored photo of the Washington Street Tunnel to prove his point. He also, on numerous occasions throughout this segment, asked why buildings that were constructed before photography existed have no photographic evidence of their construction. For example, he shows the old medical college in Augusta, Georgia, built 4 years before photography made it to the United States. Also, it's neoclassical, and again, he has pegged, it's actually Greek revival, but similar styles. He has pegged Tartarian architecture as being Moorish and Russian inspired. But there's more, because in the February 13th, 1834 issue of the Georgia Journal and Messenger, it's reported that the Board of Trustees for the Medical College of the state of Georgia are planning a new building. That's when the building was built, 1835. He also says that these buildings are very out of place for the time period, which we've pretty well demonstrated is just not true. And then he also says that in order to truly convince us, he'd have to just list them one by one, which we just did. He also says that it's weird that there's little consistency between textbooks from the 1950s and textbooks today. He doesn't give examples of that. But the textbooks are being written by the historians. Like, professional historians are the people who write history textbooks, at least at the college level. And as we do more and more historical research and more of the past comes to light, the textbooks change to reflect that new knowledge. And in fact, if the textbooks from the 1950s and the textbooks from today were the same, and that meant we had learned nothing new, that would actually be more evidence for a cover-up, in my opinion, because there's no way we didn't learn anything new in 73 years. He also asks, why is it so crazy to question that the buildings that were being built all across America, even the ones from the early 1900s, in some cases? It's kind of a weird phrasing, but it is a question. Like, I just feel like he left out a word. And it's not crazy. What's crazy is questioning it, doing no research, and then insisting that nobody can explain what happened despite mountains of evidence. Also, just really quickly, because I probably should get this out of the way because it came up in his response video to me, but I have had more fun doing this video and the last Tartaria video than I have had recently for any of our content. I love history, and this has just been an excuse for me to bury my nose into historical documents for 2 weeks. I'm having a great time. He also says, one of the things that Charlie demanded was evidence. Well, I agree. Where is the evidence that they built these old world buildings? Well, photos, newspapers, private correspondence, building records, probably a ton of government records that we just, are hidden away in some library or some basement somewhere. I mean, think about it. Most, if not all of these buildings required permits. Those permits are probably in the archives somewhere. And I know that you can say that this stuff's all fake, that it's all doctored, whatever. There's no evidence of that. You've provided none. But of course, in the video, he claims that the photos could just be doctored. But the reasoning for the doctored photos comes primarily from his opinion on Civil War photography and early war photography in general. Now, today, a lot of the pictures you get from the war front are just pictures of the war front. But at a time when camera technology really wasn't that great, again, 1865, if people were moving around on a battlefield, all that photo was gonna show was a bunch of blurry people and some smoke. So in order to make pictures of war look like war, they did often have to stage things. Now, that wasn't lying, it was kind of like painting the battle, kind of recreating it. You took a picture of the landscape, you took a picture of soldiers standing in formation, you maybe edited in photos from another picture, and you created what was, to the best of your ability, an accurate depiction of the battle that happened there. You don't really need to do that with construction photos because there's not much smoke and gunfire going on, and the building isn't charging as the bugle plays. Now listen, I'm not gonna for a second argue against doctored war photos from the 1800s and early 1900s because, well documented, we know about it. I gotta point out that you cannot claim all the photos are doctored just because the war photos are. It makes no sense. And it also does not explain why newspapers, back in the day, contemporary to these construction projects, have articles about the construction projects. And I must again point out the irony that he himself used several doctored photos in his video. And not calling out historians for doctoring them. He showed them to support his points. He wasn't showing a picture of, and showing how historians doctored it. He goes through and he shows a doctored picture and says, hey, look, there's this weird thing in the sky. Like at one point, I think we covered this in the previous video, he shows pictures of blimps carrying away an obelisk and the Arc de Triomphe. And the blimps are the same blimp. It's like taking Getty Images stock photography in Canva and making something. Like, these are some of the most obviously doctored photos I've ever seen, and he thinks those are real, but the very obviously not doctored photos of like Helena, Montana in 1870 that they would have no reason to doctor, again, those are doctored. And we kind of move into maps for a second here because he says that he's doubtful that the photos of construction are real, just as Charlie was doubtful that early maps of America depict castles. And that is because they don't depict castles, they depict settlements. When the Europeans got there, and they were asking about settlements in the interior, not the ones that they were seeing on the coasts, they had to just have them described to them, because they hadn't been there, and between the language barrier and the fact that they were very much used to walled settlements back home, stone-walled cities, a lot of the time, map makers just thought that these cities had stone walls. I mean, if you look at the depictions on these maps, they are very clearly generic walled settlements. They do not look like any of these cities. It's like somebody grabbed a stock castle icon and put it into Canva and put it on a map. And on top of that, many of these early maps were drawn by artists who hadn't even been on the expeditions. And when they were drawn by artists who had been on the expeditions, those expeditions were pretty much purely coastal. So anything you're seeing on the interior of one of these maps, nobody who drew the map, if you're talking about like the 1500s, nobody had seen that stuff. A lot of the time, they were actually relying on the description of the Native Americans given to an explorer who then got back to Portugal and gave somebody a description and said, here, draw a map. And no, I'm not saying that's how all of them were done, but you need to understand the process here. And while he's saying all of this, there is a map up on screen that shows Spanish and French claims in North America, as well as the locations of Spanish-French colonies and also Native American settlements, which brings up yet another question, which is, who are the Native Americans, Mind Unveiled? Who are the Native Americans? That is a legitimate question I have. I should also point out that the Antonio Pereira map that this is all coming from was made in 1546, and there absolutely should be Spanish and French claims on the American coastlines and even partially into the interior. Doesn't mean that they went there, it just means they claimed it. Does not mean the guy who made the map went there. So no, the map is not depicting castles, it's just poor information. And from what I could tell, it's possible that Antonio Pereira actually did travel to South America and may have been on Francisco de Orellana's expedition to explore the Amazon, but I found no evidence that he had ever been to North America. And I mean that like he himself had never been to North America as far as I can tell, which means anything he was drawing of North America was in fact based on another map or the word of somebody else. And then we move on to him claiming another photo is doctored or fake, and that is the lunch atop a skyscraper photo. And on screen, he has the word fake, and also the headline of a Washington Post article that is saying that that picture isn't what you think it is, that it's not what it seems. Now, he takes this to mean that the workers were never 70 stories up building 30 Rockefeller Plaza, and it's a composite of several images, but of course that is not what the article is saying. First of all, that building was built in 1932. There are people alive today who remember a time before it was there. They'd be very old, but they'd remember. But the thing is, those are real iron workers. They are sitting 70 stories up. They are all on an I-beam and they are eating lunch. The part that is not what it seems about the photo is this is not a candid. It wasn't a photographer up there who just casually snapped a picture. Again, 1932, that makes no sense logically, that there would be a photographer just hanging out up there. So no wonder it's staged. What was actually happening was that they were setting up for that building a marketing campaign because it was going to be opened and a whole bunch of space was going to be sold and leased inside of it. So to get everybody hyped about the new building, they took a bunch of different photos, including this one, and those kind of went out into the newspapers. And since his source for this claim seems to be that Washington Post article, I'm just going to use his source because it disagrees with him. He did not understand what he was reading, or he didn't read it. He shows us the cover art for the American Magazine in the July 1774 issue. The January 1774 issue. And on that, he points out that, it's depicting this huge city in the background, right? And also there's natives in the foreground. Well, that magazine was published in Boston, and it depicts Boston. He's saying that this is, a depiction of some massive city, but when you actually do look at it, it seems about right for Boston's population of about 16,000 plus whoever was itinerant there. So merchants, traders, soldiers, people just passing through. You probably had 20 to 25,000 people in Boston at any given time, alongside 16,000 permanent residents. And on top of all of that, it's not a photo, it's just an artist's rendition. So using this to suggest that it's a faithful representation of Boston and that this is somehow evidence that Boston was built by the Tartarians makes no sense at all. And then he talks about the 7 cities of Cibola, which are on a map attributed to Joan Martinez in 1578. Now, Joan Martinez was a Sicilian map maker who eventually moved to work for the court of either the King of Portugal or Spain. It's escaping me right now. Now, here's what's interesting. There's a 1578 map, and there's a 1587 map. In the 1578 map, the 7 cities of Cibola are shown as being north of the Tropic of Cancer and just east of Baja. The Baja Peninsula in Mexico. In the 1587 map, the Baja Peninsula looks a lot more like the actual Baja Peninsula and less like what somebody said it looked like. And there's no 7 cities of Cibola, just 9 years later. So when did the cover-up happen? Because that would imply that they were covering up the Tartarian architecture as far back as 1587. Did they find it and take it off so nobody else would find it? Did they explore and not find it? It just doesn't make any real sense. And also, if it was real and they did find it, I'm pretty sure it would be visible on Google Images today, unless they found it and covered it up, but he provided no evidence that it ever was found and covered up. And to say that, hey, the natives said this thing was here and we didn't find it, therefore that's doctored history, it's not. The math ain't mathin'. And additionally, I'll admit I didn't actually look into the possibility of this, but it did occur to me that logically, it could make sense that the Aztecs, who were being terrorized by the Spanish, might suggest to the Spanish that there were a bunch of much wealthier and larger cities to the north that they should go check out. And furthermore, as far as I can tell, Joan Martinez never actually went to America, so that needs to be considered when looking at his maps and considering how accurate they may be. So it doesn't really matter that he depicted the 7 cities of Cibola as being stone-walled with towers, because he himself never saw them, nor did anyone else in recorded history. Like, we're talking about El Dorado. And he also says that he trusts these ancient manuscripts more than photography, which is something I simply cannot address kindly. But since we're talking about trust, I think we should hit pause and talk a moment about the people he does trust. He consistently cites a Connor McDarry, whose real name was John A. Guerin, and he was born in 1860 and died in 1947. Since Mind Unveiled cites McDarry religiously, I picked up a copy of the book. This was originally published in 1923. And McDarry claims that the Irish were masters of the whole earth. So we're taking this a little farther than Mind Unveiled did, claiming explicitly that their empire was worldwide. And it should be said, then, that McDarry's sources, by necessity, are older than his book. His sources on Egypt, which is an important part of his thesis, are as follows in the order of their citation. He cites Donnelly in 1882, Tyler, misspelled as Taylor in McDarry's book, in 1881, and Osborne, no further citation given, who is present in Donnelly and therefore pre-1882, Rawlinson in 1877, and Goodrich in 1838. Worse still, the passage where he cites all of those people is basically just plagiarized out of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly. And Donnelly was writing long before Egypt was properly understood or excavated by actual archaeologists. But we'll come back to Donnelly. But I would argue that McDarry's most important contribution to Mind Unveiled's theory is a glossary of Irish and Hebrew words that look, sound, and mean the same things. That glossary is right here, right on this page. Now, what's interesting about this glossary is that it's almost completely fake. He cites J.M. Price, who was a theosophist writer active in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, who wrote in 1910 that Hebrew was originally the priestly language of Egypt. While there are definitely loan words between Hebrew and Egyptian, they are not dialects of the same language. Now, of course, the Price citation is just for the one bit about Hebrew and Irish, and that being the original dialect, but we're mostly working off of Donnelly here because McDarry is citing Donnelly anyway. It's important to mention that Donnelly was writing in 1882, and the Merneptah Stela, which bears the inscription, "Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more," was discovered in 1896 and dates to around 1200 BC. Now, in my opinion, the Exodus probably occurred as a historical event between 1207 and 1206 BC from the winter to the spring, and this is because many of the events described in Exodus fit that timeline. Historical events, astronomical events, architectural advances, things like that. I won't go into the details here, but, that makes sense for the Exodus. Now, why would Merneptah say something along the lines of, we've completely wiped out the Israelites? Couple of possibilities. A, either he saw them go off into the wilderness and just assumed they all died out there, or he didn't want to record a defeat, which is very common of ancient rulers. Caesar was prolific about this. He did not report defeats. It was actually part of the reason that he was able to keep going in Gaul, is because nobody ever knew he was losing until, much later. But the Merneptah Stela, which was again 1896 but dates to 1200 or so BC, combined with the 2022 discovery of a small lead tablet found on Mount Ebal in Israel, which bears the inscription of a curse with the word Yahweh in ancient Hebrew, in basically Proto-Hebrew. When you combine those two, it really, really, really just obliterates the timeline here. How could the Catholics have doctored Hebrew scripture in Israel literally 2,000 years before they moved the Jews to Israel from Ireland? How does that line up? It proves that the Jews were writing about the Hebrew people, the people of the Levant, were writing about Yahweh long before the Catholics existed, let alone were writing about him. But that's really only disproving the timeline. What about the vocab? McDarry and his sources as well were writing during a time when the modern field of linguistics was just starting to come about. People in the 1800s were only just starting to ask the question, hey, did all of our languages in Europe descend from the same one? At the time, some people believed that European or Aryan languages, as they were called at the time, developed in the East, in Persia, that area, with Sanskrit being the oldest. But that didn't quite make sense, so some people looked west and said, well, what if it originated in the west and moved east? But others looked north. They thought, what if it didn't come from the west or the east? What if it spread from somewhere else? And what they found is that that's what happened. Basically, a group called the Yamnaya culture today were the original Indo-European speakers. They were the people who brought the European language to Europe as well as the Middle East. That's why Iranian and some Northern Indian languages are actually more similar to English and German than they are to Semitic and Eastern languages. And since Sanskrit and Irish both derive from Proto-Indo-European, it makes sense that one is not derived from the other. McDarry also claims that the entire captivity of the Jews in Egypt was a myth, which I will be honest, is an actual scholarly theory. There are some people who believe that. There is another camp who disagrees. But between the Stela, which says Israel is laid waste right when the Exodus would have been, and the tablet being where it should be for 1200 or so BC, after the Exodus, with the word Yahweh on it, strong evidence to the contrary, and that McDarry is just wrong here. He also goes on to claim that the Irish word for Jews derives from the Irish word Yud, which would mean day or light, according to McDarry. But the closest I could find was Yud spelled differently, which is a pronoun meaning that, and does not mean Jews. And this isn't the only time, because he provides a list of jargonized Irish and Hebrew words that he claims bear similarity. For example, Ab is given as father in both, but it actually means abbot in Irish and father in Hebrew. Abel and Abad, and if I am butchering these pronunciations, I apologize, but I don't think these are real words half the time anyway, from what I can tell. So, and I'm not saying all of the words are fake words, I'm just saying that a lot of these words are not what they are supposed to be. But Abel and Abad are both given as death, however, neither word means death. In fact, neither word even seems to exist in its given spelling, though Avad does apparently mean father in Hebrew. Then he gives Ba as meaning cows in Irish, and he gives no Hebrew counterpart. Additionally, Ba does not mean cow in Irish. There is a Bo that means cow in Irish, though. Bahem and Abad are both also given as to die. The Hebrew is spelled wrong, as I mentioned, and the Irish word doesn't exist or doesn't mean death. If it does, I checked. He's also unclear about whether he's comparing Old Irish and Biblical Hebrew, or Old Irish and Modern Hebrew, or Modern Irish and Old Hebrew. There's not a lot of clarity for what's going on here. Also, jargonized does not mean what he used it for. I'm still not entirely sure what he meant by jargonized. I think he means anglicized the spelling. Additional point here, there is no evidence that John Guerin, Connor McDarry, ever went to Ireland or spoke Irish. Basta is given as shower alongside the Hebrew bastek, but neither word means shower. The former, in an Irish dictionary, gave me baptism in the modern Irish and did not return any word for the Old Irish. Ban and bahin are both given for Hebrew, but I couldn't find the word bahin in any Hebrew dictionary. Ban does mean woman, though, and there is a different Hebrew word for woman that sounds nothing like bahin. Dub is given with dob as great, prodigious, black, or burned. Great and burned are not synonyms, nor is prodigious a synonym of burned, but dub can mean black. But I also did look up the Hebrew, I looked up the English to Hebrew, and not a single one of those words returned dob as a translation. Ice and aish are both given as man, but ice means to exist in modern Irish and to track in Old Irish, whereas fair means man now. The Hebrew spelling is way off for that to mean what he's saying it means, but the sound is close enough, I guess. And the thing is, the rest of the list continues in this manner. It's completely made up. Also, I haven't read the entire book, but I'm pretty sure he doesn't actually say what Irish dictionary he used for this, or what Hebrew dictionary he used. He just kind of cites other people. Yeah, I'm looking through it right now, live on camera. Aiden can see that happening, and I don't see any... Yeah, he doesn't cite what dictionaries he's using. That's hilarious. Also, he says, and I quote, "Every Celtic scholar, investigator, and thinker will at once comprehend the incontrovertible nature of the proof here submitted in this list of Irish words with their Hebrew derivatives as to who the Jews and Hebrews were. British and Roman lies cannot prevail against it." Hey guys, I concentrated on Celtic studies. He's wrong. I see no link between Hebrew and Irish aside from the possibility of a few loanwords. I want to point out, by the way, that was him saying Celtic scholars will agree. No, they don't. Now, as for Donnelly, a little bit less crazy, but more because he had less access to information than McDarry. So McDarry just comes across as insane, Donnelly comes across as uninformed, to the modern sensibilities. Early in his book on Atlantis, Donnelly claimed that Egypt had no archaic period, and that their architecture simply showed up as is. No prior evolution of style or technique, just we found these incredible pyramids and these temples, and clearly there's no evidence of any period of like a Bronze Age or a Copper Age or a Neolithic. Yeah, it actually says, one of the people he cites, says that there is no evidence of a Neolithic Egypt. It's not true, at least not now. But you can't quite fault Donnelly for it because Egypt was still not totally understood. In fact, he was writing before the full excavation of most of the pyramids, including the smaller step pyramids that definitely predate the Great Pyramids. Since we have now step pyramids as well as the Great Pyramids, it's clear that those are not the same style, one is older than the other, and all evidence points to the step pyramids being the older ones. What's more, as far as I can tell, Donnelly never went to Egypt or Ireland. He was writing entirely based on the works of others that he had read. And all of this was done before any of the major excavations you hear about, like King Tut. And even just taking the pyramids entirely out of it, if we just look at things that are definitively tombs and nothing else, and no, I'm not saying the pyramids are like an electricity station or some kind of thing, I'm just saying that I don't want to get into that right now. So if we just look at tombs, there is a very clear evolution of pre-pyramid tombs to temple tombs to pyramid tombs, and then actually back to temple tombs. So here's the kicker. Everything Donnelly knew about Egypt in 1881 to 82 when he was writing his book was lacking the understanding that we had yet to find a bunch of older Egyptian stuff. The pre-pyramid tombs were discovered in 1902. King Tut, I think, was 1915. And there are more issues with Donnelly, but the simple lack of information available to him in 1882 is really enough to make the point. And also, I'm not an Egyptologist, Celtic scholar, medieval studies scholar. Another very commonly cited source here is Michael Tsarion, who is a writer. I wasn't really sure how to describe him. Now, Tsarion, of course, goes on to cite McDarry, who cites Donnelly, and Tsarion also cites Donnelly. The problem here is that everything kind of goes back to Donnelly, and Donnelly's work, again, was way before a ton of modern stuff that really did clear all of this up with substantiated evidence. But Tsarion displays a stunning lack of understanding of Christian theology at one point in his book, and I thought it was worth mentioning. Because I was going through and I was just looking around for stuff that I was like, all right, what has he mentioned in the video that Tsarion might have said, right? Well, Tsarion refers to the donation of Constantine as the scandalous forgery upon which Christianity was created, but seems to not understand what it was, because it wasn't that. The donation, also known as the donatio, was a forged document that was most likely created in the late 700s or mid 700s. It's believed that it was meant to basically convince Pepin the Short or Charlemagne to give back lands the Pope had given to the Franks, because according to the donation of Constantine, back in, like 325 or something, wrote a document in which he gave away the entire western half of the Roman Empire to the Catholic Church, to the Pope. Now, of course, this never happened. And even in the 1400s, people were able to realize and prove that this was a forgery. But from the 8th century even into the 15th century, the donation of Constantine was still being trotted out by the Vatican. And the idea here was that Constantine had given control of the western half of the Roman Empire over to, I think it was Pope Sylvester I. But Sylvester I, or whichever pope it actually was, he kindly just gave it all back. He was like, no, you're better equipped to handle this, but that he never formally ceded the land back, so what that means is that the Catholic Church actually is the chief authority in Western Europe, even over all secular rulers. Now, like I said, it is a known forgery. But it was not a theological forgery. The entire point of the document was that the Pope has authority over secular authorities. So its theological impact was pretty minimal, but what it did do was give specifically the Catholic Church, and keep in mind, not the Eastern Church. The Bishop of Rome was the only person who was benefiting from this document. It was used for this purpose numerous times, including once by Pope Leo IX when he was asserting his supremacy over Michael I, the Patriarch of Byzantine Christianity, of Constantinople. And according to Joseph Wisniewski at Virginia Polytechnic, the document was used by at least 10 popes. Its use against Michael I is part of what led to the Great Schism of 1054, and it was used again when writing the Dictatus Papae and, giving the reasoning for this document's existence under Pope Gregory VII. This, of course, was during the investiture controversy where he was in a bit of a kerfuffle with Henry V of the Holy Roman Empire. But I felt like we needed to address the three authors he cites most often, because, again, both Sarian is building off of McDarry, who's building off of Donnelly, who was fundamentally incorrect due to a lack of information available to him at the time. McDarry and Sarian have absolutely no excuse. But let's get back to the fourth person in this line, which is Mind Unveiled. And immediately after saying that he trusts maps drawn by people who never saw the locations they were describing more than he trusts photography, he shows us a photograph of the laying of the capstone of the Salt Lake City Mormon Temple. There is an Eye of Providence in this photo, and clearly the implication, because he zooms in on it, is that the Freemasons staged the photo. In reality, Masonic capstone laying ceremonies are very much a thing, and Joseph Smith was a Freemason and brought a ton of Masonic stuff into Mormonism, including Masonic symbols, Masonic rituals, Masonic hierarchies. He basically took a bunch of Mason stuff and worked it into Mormonism. So, A, Joseph Smith was a Freemason. It makes sense that there was Masonic symbolism involved. And B, why would the Freemasons leave evidence that they forged it? By the way, there's absolutely no reason to think that this photo is staged or doctored. There's literally no reason. But I'm going to keep going because he does too, because he shows us an image of Mormon miners at a quarry cutting stone for that specific temple, and he claims that it's fake. He actually shows two different images, but talks about them as if they're the same one, which I'm not sure if that's just because he doesn't realize he's using two different pictures, or if he's genuinely trying to deceive people. Once again, I really can't tell. And considering this is still within the vein of it only took them a few years to build these massive structures when in Europe it took hundreds, it took 40 years to complete the Salt Lake City Mormon Temple. It was not a short process, and that was with considerable advancements in construction technology between the building of cathedrals and then. Also, cathedrals were considerably more ornate than the Mormon Temple is. In the first photo, he claims that the sky was removed from it because it appears to just be kind of a white background, and also that a man has his legs through a piece of stone, and therefore the left side of the photo was added in later, was edited in. First of all, it is a photo taken in 1872, so the sky probably wasn't going to be all that detailed anyway. As for the man, he's just leaning against a stone block at an angle, and because soft tissue is soft, it kind of molds itself to stone. It's very obvious that he's just leaning against a block. His legs are not through. It's taken at an angle where you can see, like, the angle is what's causing it to look like his legs are going through the stone. He then proceeds to show a manipulated version of the same exact image, claiming that the vanilla skies are the key to knowing that this is a photoshopped image. And once again, his vanilla skies thing from the photoshopped one that he showed. He then shows a second photo from the same angle, but clearly taken several minutes or even possibly hours later, but most likely several minutes later. And he says that the sky has been removed and that there is a floating ladder. Oh, and of course there are no faces on any of the people in the photograph. So again, old photo, taken outdoors, in the hot sun, everyone's wearing a hat. Of course there's shadows over their faces. And on top of that, one guy's face is visible, and also another guy's features are visible in silhouette. I also must ask the question, why would they remove their faces while doctoring the photo? Like, would they not take people with faces and put them in? The floating ladder is clearly just leaning against a rock at an angle, and its shadow is there too, so did they edit in the shadow as well? And I will say that the second photo, which is a stereographic image, so it's meant to be viewed through a viewfinder thing that makes things look kind of 3D. It's just, old school 3D. But the sky in the background, I'm thinking based on pictures that I saw of that quarry today, that's not the sky. I'm pretty sure that's like the quarry wall. Furthermore, if you look at the stereoscopic one he shows, the way those work is that they are supposed to be two identical copies of an image, right? And that they are supposed to appear to be in 3D. So, if they're doctored, they should be identical. But if you look at what he claims is the removed sky, it's not identical, which suggests that either this was errors made during copying, that it's the age of the photo and things just started to look weird, maybe even that it was the scan of the photo that made it look that way. But this clearly is not photo manipulation. This is just low quality photography. He also doesn't seem to grasp that a lot of early photographs were touched up by artists when people appeared blurry or when not enough people actually showed up in frame because it was a cityscape, which meant a long exposure. So there's a lot of other possibilities here as to why the pictures don't look the way he expects them to, and most of them are related to his lack of understanding of early photography. Although at one point he actually does mention the exposure times, but doesn't address it. He claims that that's a whole nother video. So maybe he does understand it, or maybe he thinks he understands it. I really don't know. But what I do know is that the things he points out about this photo are completely explicable by technology. He goes on to say, the Mormons are said to have created multiple massive temple churches with no modern technology, and yet they're photo manipulating photos? He says that, but then doesn't really elaborate. I don't understand what the comparison is here. There's no logical connection here. Also, he didn't prove they were manipulating photos. He pointed out some completely reasonable low-quality photo artifacts, basically. He also does mention that the Book of Mormon says that there were people here with advanced cities long before the Europeans got here, and I'll give him credit. He does say that we probably shouldn't take the Book of Mormon literally, but he thinks it's an odd coincidence that the Mormons mentioned it. Like, why mention it? Unless they thought it was true, unless they had reason to believe it. Of course, there are significant differences between the Mormon description of the Lamanites and Tartaria, but he also neglected to mention that when the Mormons got to what is now Utah and Colorado, they thought that the Ute Native American peoples were the Lamanites. And then he reiterates his question from earlier, asking, how can we trust the history of these old world buildings when our historical record on many of these buildings is scarce? But as we've shown, it's not scarce, he just didn't look for it, and when there is evidence presented to him, he just claims it's fake. And then we're on to Great Fires, and he goes back to the Mormon connection here for a second, and I want to point out why that is ridiculous. It's because he uses a quote about the Lamanites from the Book of Mormon to talk about cities burning down. But what he doesn't seem to catch or understand is that the Mormons thought the Lamanites were Jewish, because the Lamanites are descendants of Jewish people from Israel who came over here around 600 BC after the Neo-Assyrians took over the area. Yes, that is correct. We are talking about some of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. So that is a long time before his alleged hijack of the real Irish story and how it was shifted over onto Aramaic-speaking Syrians. By the way, Aramaic and Hebrew are very, very closely related in a way that is undeniable compared to when you try to connect Hebrew to Irish. So it makes no sense that there were already people speaking Aramaic in the Middle East and Hebrew was an Irish language. No sense made. Although he does suggest that, I guess there's the linguistic issue of if you're claiming that Irish was the first language and that it expanded eastward, then you could theoretically have a derivative language in the Middle East by then. But also there's no archaeological evidence of the Irish until 600 BC. being in Ireland. But I must point out that Jews in 600 BC definitely, absolutely cannot conform to the narrative of Tartaria presented by Mind Unveiled. He definitively says there were not Jews in 600 BC, that it was still the Irish. But moreover, the passage is about events from over 2 millennia ago, but he's using it as evidence that the great fires of the 19th century all over America were deliberate. So he's using a description of events that allegedly, according to Joseph Smith, occurred in 600 BC or so to support the narrative that the great fires of the 19th century were deliberate. So what was the motive for these great fires, for actually purposefully setting them? Well, clearly it was to get rid of all the Tartarian architecture, all the evidence that they had ever been there, except for all of the massive buildings that we supposedly didn't destroy, like the ones from Chicago and Tampa and Philadelphia and New York that he claims were all Tartarian that I guess just nobody thought to destroy around this time. Also, we're talking about fires that occurred over the course of a century. It's not like there was a spate of a whole bunch of fires in 1 year or 1 decade, and then we were able to just pretend this never happened. This was a century long. No, it couldn't possibly be that most buildings in American cities at the time were constructed with wooden frames. It also can't be the introduction of kerosene lighting. But just to go through it to show you how this makes no sense at all, Chicago in 1871 was started when a cow kicked over a lantern. At least that's how the story goes. Now, in a barn, kicks over a lantern. Lantern lights stuff on fire. The barn is made of wood. The barn catches on fire. Wind carries the burning embers across to other buildings that are also wood framed or even made of wood. And then by the time all the fire needs to do is get into one building that's actually like a bigger building, like one of the blocks. And at that point, it's going to spread through the foundation. It's going to spread through the frames. It's going to become an inferno. It's going to spread even further as fire moves onto roofs. I mean, there's no good reason to doubt that a cow knocking over a lantern in a barn could cause a fire. San Francisco in 1851 probably was arson, and it started in a shop containing paint and upholstery, which are two very flammable things. Boston in 1872 started in the basement of a warehouse that was holding dry goods, and thousands of people witnessed the attempts to fight it. Additionally, it destroyed the financial district. Pittsburgh in 1845 was started when somebody tried to heat some water with a fire, and it was a drought, and the wind carried the burning embers, and they hit other flammable dry stuff, and boom, fire. Galveston in 1875 was a foundry explosion. Newburyport in 1811 was arson. Portland in 1866 appears to have been firecrackers, which would make sense since the fire started on Independence Day. And on top of all of this, we have pictures of the burned out, very much not old world style brick buildings that were most of the victims of these fires. And the fires didn't burn down the entire cities for the most part. In most of these cases, large portions of the city were still standing and only a bit of it actually burned down. Caused a lot of damage, but it typically didn't burn down the entire city. And it also must be mentioned, if you are trying to destroy the records of a civilization, the architecture of a civilization that built in stone, why would you use fire? And no, this isn't just, made up stuff later that somebody came up with in the 20th century. Newspaper reports from the time absolutely confirm that this is what people believed started these fires when the fires happened. He also claims that they were building things to be fireproof back then, and they just weren't. Like, fire resistant, yes, there's a reason we used brick. It's because as long as the fire doesn't get into the foundation, into the frame, a brick house is going to do pretty well. Significantly better than a wooden house. But also, like I said, we have pictures of the cities after these fires, and we have the burned out brick buildings. He doesn't say the Tartarians built in brick. Most of the buildings he claims are Tartarian are masonry. So, not brick, stone. And I'm not saying masonry as in Freemasonry. I'm saying masonry as in like masons, like stonemasons built it. But Mind Unveiled simply dismisses all evidence of what might have started these fires while providing no evidence to the contrary. He just says, it's weird that all of these fires happened. It's really not. I mean, his argument is pretty well described as being, if the brick buildings were built to be fireproof, how could a cow knocking over a lantern cause $220 million in damages? Wooden frames. Wooden frames and floors burn away, everything collapses. Having convinced himself that the fires were deliberate, he then asks, why would we build all of this just to burn it down? Well, obviously we wouldn't, so they must have been burning down Tartarian stuff, right? Problem with this is, he still never showed any evidence that this was a deliberate, organized effort to burn down old cities, and also, like I said, brick buildings that were clearly new builds, and also we have all of this huge Tartarian architecture, and most of the cities survived for the most part. So, it doesn't even make sense. If that's what they were trying to do, they did a pretty bad job of it. And he also uses Sherman's March to the Sea as one of the examples when scorched earth tactics in warfare, very, very common, very well known. And then And then we move along to the next subject here, which is secret societies. And I mean, you ever have somebody explain something to you that you're an expert in the most arrogant and incorrect way possible? Same. The very first thing he does in this section is show an image drawn and printed by Leo Taxil. Seems to be depicting Scottish Rite Masons at some form of ball, and for some reason in the background over what appears to be some sort of, like, just a tent for some reason, he has the words Tartarian tent ? It doesn't really look like the actual tents of actual Tatar peoples, so I'm not sure why that was used. But also, if you're familiar with the anti-Masonic movement and all of that, you probably know the word or the name Leo Taxil, and we'll get to him in a second. The next image he shows is a French work, which in English is titled The Mirror of the Past to Safeguard the Future. And on screen, he's written, okay, then you explain what's going on here. Well, the gist is that it's French revolutionary artwork basically warning the tyrants and radicals of the future about the mistakes of the tyrants and radicals of the past. Now, I don't read French, so I can't read what's on it, but it wasn't that hard to find something that tells you what the image is depicting, and if you look at it, it makes sense. Like, that description does make sense. His whole point seems to be that it's a weird image. There's an Eye of Providence at the top, but that doesn't mean it was drawn by a Mason. The Eye of Providence was a well-known and widely used Christian symbol. He's also quite interested in Phrygian caps, which there's a section of the video where he kind of describes why they're important a little bit more, but I honestly didn't have time. But I'm just going to quickly put aside any confusion as to why there's Phrygian caps everywhere. In the late Roman imperial period, the Phrygian cap was the status of a freeman, a freed slave, somebody like that. So you'd wear a Phrygian cap to denote your status in society. Eventually, it became associated with the goddess of freedom, Libertas, and as American and French revolutionary movements began to embrace liberty as a central tenet, they started to use the Phrygian cap as a symbol. Now, he seems to think that this connects to the fact that it's shown on a relief of Mithras, who's a ancient Indo-Iranian deity of light and justice and order. He was a very well-known and beloved god amongst the Persians and eventually even amongst the Romans. Now, I'm not sure exactly when the relief he showed is from, like when it was made, but it depicts Mithras slaying a bull and he's wearing a Phrygian cap. This is not weird. The Phrygian cap was extremely common everyday headwear in the classical era. We see depictions of it on Thracians, on Dacians, on Greeks, on Phrygians, on Persians, on Scythians. It was just a common piece of headwear. And by the way, that's not like we have people who tell us in textbooks that it was a very common piece of headwear. We have coins, and we have statues, and mosaics. Like, we have the archaeological evidence that this was used. But still trying to connect it with secret societies and the Illuminati and the Freemasons and all that, he shows another example of the Phrygian cap being depicted on the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is, of course, basically France's Declaration of Independence, their revolutionary constitution moment. I mean, as we just said, it was well known to be associated with movements about liberty. Are you wondering what this has to do with the video? Same, because at the moment that he's talking about it within the Secret Society segment, he just blows right past it. He just shows us some Phrygian caps and then moving swiftly along. There's also a comment that he makes about how the word founded is actually supposed to be the year they found the cities. Now, this is pretty etymologically unsound. We could get into why that's ridiculous on its face, but let's talk about the etymology of the words found and founded. Because English is not a language. English is 4 languages in a trench coat. Founded, as in like to found something, comes from the Roman word fundus, which means base. So foundation, the foundation of a building, the base of a building, fundus, foundation, founded. But to have found something comes from find, and of course find comes from German finden. So Latin root for to found something, Germanic root for to have found something. Then we're on to Freemasons and Oddfellows, and I can't comment much on the Oddfellows, but I do know a good deal about the Freemasons. Deftly showing his complete understanding of Masonic symbolism, he shows us a map with a compass on it, implying that the map was drawn by the Freemasons, when compasses are a very common tool, in fact, a absolutely fundamentally necessary tool in cartography, and also the legend for mileage is inside the compass. It's an artistic way of showing the scale of the map. He also shows what appears to be a woodcut or a woodcut print of what is called Les Freemasons. And it has a little bit that is blown up, which is labeled Scots Masons Lodge, Devil Temple Bar JJ5. Now, of course, that must mean that they were devil worship. The Devil Temple? Like, oh my God, they're Satan worshippers. These were proto-Scots Rite Masons. The Scottish Rite didn't really coalesce until the 1800s, but early on there were people who were more interested in the occult and esoteric ideas, and they formed Scots Masons lodges. Scottish Masonry really, really blew up in France. But the thing is, it wasn't the Devil's Temple Bar. It was the Devil's Tavern in the Temple Bar room. And yes, the Devil Tavern is there. You can still see where it was. I don't think it's still the Devil's Tavern, but the building is still there and it is marked as being the old Devil's Tavern. He then goes on to suggest that it's strange that there are Freemason lodges, Oddfellows lodges, and Knights of Columbus lodges in most major cities in the United States, saying, is that not suspicious or worthy of a note in the history books? It isn't suspicious, and it's in the history books. First off, Freemasonry hit its peak in the 1950s when 4.5% of American men were Masons. That's a lot. This means that in a small town with just 1,000 men, statistically it was likely that 45 of them would be Freemasons. That is absolutely enough people to make a lodge in that town necessary, especially pre-automobile. And then he goes on to say that obviously Freemasons in the modern day are not the same thing that they were 100 years ago. My lodge has minutes going back to 1860. That tell us exactly what happened at the meeting. It's not different from what it is now. But he is mostly correct in saying that today, it's primarily just old dudes getting together once a month. We'd like to push back on a couple of things. We do have young people, and we also provide millions of dollars, millions upon millions of dollars per year to charities, schools, libraries, widows' homes, things like that. And I won't deny that some of the Scottish Rite stuff does seem a little weird at first glance. I haven't done most of it, I've just read about it, and I'll admit I have some reservations, and I do intend to go through with it just so I can understand what happens, but nothing of it feels sinister to me. Just a little weird. Back in the day, however, he claims that we were doing some pretty weird rituals. His evidence? Well, the first piece is literally an anti-Masonic cartoon. It was created in 1804, and the artist used a pseudonym, but it is obviously, looking at it, it's a caricature. It's a very obvious caricature. And I gotta say, showing that picture as evidence without informing everybody that it's a caricature, that it's anti-Masonic, that it's a joke at the expense of the Masons, is akin to lying. And then the next two he shows are further illustrations from Leo Taxil, which means it's time to talk about Leo Taxil. Taxil, whose real name was Marie-Joseph Gabriel Antoine Jogan Paget, was a French writer who really hated the Catholic Church. He even described the clergy as hedonistic creatures, which to me is ironic because he himself was French. I mean, pot meet kettle. So after writing a series of works calling Catholics just the worst possible things, in 1885, he publicly denounced his previous works and professed his conversion to Catholicism, and it went pretty well for him. And then he proceeded to write almost the same kind of thing about the Freemasons that he previously had been writing about the Catholics. And the church, because they hated Freemasonry, loved it. In fact, even today, becoming a Freemason is still technically grounds for excommunication in the Catholic Church. Excommunication in the Catholic Church means that your immortal soul doesn't go to heaven. They hate Freemasons that much. And keep in mind, this isn't your average Catholic. This is the official doctrine of the clergy. So I'm not saying that your average Catholic is, horrible and evil. It's just, come on, guys. The guys upstairs need to be a little. But his most famous work on Freemasonry, alleged based on the writings of an alleged Masonic satanic cult survivor named Diana Vaughn, they claimed that the Freemasons had an entire sect of Satanists, and that the one that she was part of, the one that she was a victim of, was located in South Carolina. Taxil's work got him the opportunity to rub elbows with the highest of the clergy, and it even got him a meeting with the Pope himself. But by the 1890s, and particularly 1897, the public had more questions, because Freemasonry was still a pretty well-known and common thing, even in France, although French Freemasonry is kind of weird and I personally don't consider it real Freemasonry, but that's, neither here nor there. My reason is that to be a French Freemason, you don't have to believe in a deity. You can be an atheist, which to me, it completely removes the entire point of Freemasonry. So, the public at this point They had questions. They were wondering, and there were bishops in the United States saying this was a lie. There were prominent Freemasons saying this was a lie, and a whole bunch of American presidents had been Freemasons, so a lot of people wanted to know, is this real? Can you produce this Diana Vaughn? If you spoke to her, clearly you must be able to show us her writings, her person, something along those lines. So in 1897, Taxil called a press conference. He told everybody that Diana Vaughn was going to be there in person to tell her story. Instead, he got up on that stage and revealed to the entire crowd that all of it was a hoax. Of his own volition, by the way. This was not something he was forced to do. He chose to do this. He got up on stage and told everybody that he made the entire thing up, and Diana Vaughn was the name of his typist who had allowed him to use the name. Everything that he did was basically just trying to conform to the confirmation bias of the Catholic Church regarding their opinions on Freemasonry, and he thanked them for helping him spread the hoax. It was all one big trick on the Catholic Church, using the Freemasons as the bait. It's actually pretty impressive. And then in a 1906 interview with National Magazine, he confirmed yet again, a decade later, that it really was all a hoax. So the fact that Mind Unveiled used Taxil, who's like the most debunkable anti-Masonic writer of all time, is wild to me. It means he did no research into the images that he was putting on screen. I also want to point out that the entire point he's making in all of this is that the Catholic Church is pulling the strings behind the Freemasons and the Illuminati and the Oddfellows and all of these other secret societies. But I have to ask the question, if being a Freemason literally gets your place in heaven taken away from you, how is the Catholic Church pulling the strings? Like, in fact, they even started the Knights of Columbus as a competitive organization to Freemasonry for Catholic men. Well, according to Mind Unveiled, it's all mind control. He says that the Freemasons, and of course the Oddfellows, are the mind-controlled orphans of the Phoenician families. Considering we've roundly debunked the whole Irish connection and Phoenician thing, I'm not even I'm hesitant to bother. Nonetheless, he claims that these are the top orphans of the club. Secret societies, he claims, have always been present in the Catholic Church. You see, according to him, these Freemasons were called knights. He says this while a illustration is on screen of a Templar knight communing over a crystal ball with Baphomet. Baphomet, of course, had absolutely nothing to do with the Knights Templar. What actually happened is that the Crusades were over, and now what existed was, in France, a Catholic military order that was absolutely wealthy enough to rival entire kingdoms. In fact, Philip IV, the King of France, was very deeply in debt to them, and the Catholic Church could no longer really control them now that the Crusades were over, and they had nowhere to fight in the Middle East. So there was a concern that the Templars would maybe try their hand at politics. In order to solve both of these problems, King Philip IV, with his debt, and the Catholic Church, with their rogue knights, they decided to work together, and they created an entire fictional story and forced confessions of things about worshiping Satan and sodomy and being forced to make out with each other to become knights. Like, there was no evidence of any of it. All of it was eventually recanted because they were confessions given under duress. And it was used to either kill them or force them into exile. And then there were some who were allowed to join either a version of the Knights Templar that was allowed to continue in Portugal, or to go to one of the other crusading orders like the Teutonic Knights, who were actually still crusading in Eastern Europe. And he's saying, he's talking about all of this as he's showing an article on screen from Wikipedia about the suppression of the Knights Templar by King Philip. And what else does he support it with? More of Leo Taxil's illustrations. Illustrations, of course, based on the lies that the Catholics told about the Templars. But then he claims that the Templars became the Freemasons and the Illuminati. Now, I will say this. Freemasonry does hold that we are either the literal direct successors of the Knights Templar, and that Freemasonry was founded by Templars in exile, or that it's more of a spiritual succession from the Knights Templar. Personally, when I go to do my PhD, this is what I want to do my thesis, my dissertation on, is I want to write about, is this the true history of Freemasonry? And he does then go on to clarify that Freemasonry is not the Illuminati, which is correct. The Illuminati were an offshoot of Freemasonry whose goals were to corrupt Freemasonry until it became powerful enough and also, followed their ideals so they could use it to try and topple the Catholic Church and secular governments to form a kind of a new world order that was atheist and not based upon, the old world way of doing things. It failed, though there is an argument to be made about how similar French Freemasonry is with Illuminati ideals and the way the French Revolution differed from the American Revolution. So there's a discussion to be had there, but that's for another video. And then, as all of this is going on, he's got a graphic on screen that claims that, where is it here? Zionism was created by the Jesuits. The Jesuits are Masonic. No. And that all of this whole thing, is built on Babylonian Kabbalistic Masonic doctrine. He does not elaborate. He then goes on to claim that the Oddfellows were formed to educate the orphans of the Phoenician families while simultaneously finding it odd that they ran orphanages. He leaves out the rest of their mission, which is visit the sick, relieve the distressed, and educate the orphan. Occam's razor, dude. They were just taking care of orphans. That was it. What's more likely, that this is all veiled symbolism about some sort of ancient Catholic cabal that overtook the Irish religion, and that there's, that they symbolized these secret societies of orphans as orphans of this thing, and that then they started orphanages to hide it? Or is it more likely that they just started orphanages because it was a good thing to do, because there were orphans? And then he goes on to repeat the same nonsense about no construction photos and shows more of Leo Taxil's drawings. And at this point, it's starting to feel more like deception than ignorance, but I'm not a mind reader. And with literally no evidence except his own cynicism, he goes on to claim that this can't possibly just be the Oddfellows doing this out of the good of their hearts, right? It can't. And I know that there's gonna be somebody who comments at this point in the video and goes, yeah, well, maybe you should watch his video on orphan trains and things. And I mean, I've already explained why so much of the foundation of that is BS that I'm not gonna go into that. My whole point in doing this is to take out the legs so that all of the other stuff built upon the foundation crumbles. Mind Unveiled's argument is fundamentally wrong about almost everything, to the extent that it's not worth getting into the mud with the later stuff, but you know what? If I have to, I will. Don't test me. I am a man with far too much time who makes money doing this. But of course, he immediately supports his argument with the idea of orphan trains, which were a real thing. People did in fact take orphans from the big cities, where there was basically no prospects for them, and oftentimes these were the children of immigrants who died in the factories or, of sickness, or simply gave them up because they couldn't afford to take care of their children. And the thought was, hey, if we ship these kids off into the suburbs, maybe they can find better homes. And then they thought, all right, well, what about the Midwest? We can send them out there too. And of course, Mind Unveiled categorizes this as basically them abducting children for slave labor. But the reality is that when you study what happened, when you look at the evidence, when you read the documents about these orphans' lives, there were pretty mixed results. Some definitely did end up being just farm laborers, and people took them on and did not take good care of them, but a lot of them also found very loving homes. But there's another problem here, which is that he's connecting this to the Oddfellows, and there is no evidence that the Oddfellows were involved with orphan trains. And the evidence actually suggests the opposite. The orphan trains were typically taking people and trying to set them up with families. The Oddfellows were putting kids up in orphanages. These are different concepts, different missions, different goals, and different groups. He then notes that it's strange that foundling hospitals, which are basically just early orphanages, are so often constructed in old world architecture. And he shows us a couple examples. One is the Foundling Hospital in London, England, which is the old world. The other is Bremer Sanatorium in Sokolowsko, Poland, which you'll note is also the old world. So what he's saying here is that it's weird that foundling hospitals have old world architecture, and the only examples he provided were in Europe. And then he goes on to mention the Monteagle House Hotel, which is in Niagara Falls, and obviously has no construction photos because daguerreotype photography. There's probably one copy, and it's probably not on the internet. And that's, of course, because it was constructed over the course of 7 years from 1848 to 1855, and commercial cameras capable of doing negative style copies would not be on the market widely until the last year of its construction. By the way, 7 years is really not even all that fast for like a 4 or 5 story building. And I'll be honest, I'm also gonna just not even address the section about postcards that show babies in cabbages, because he goes on to claim that babies used to grow out of cabbages, basically. And he also claims, it's not necessarily that. He shows these incubators that were shown off at the World's Fair. And the thing about the incubators was that was a major advancement in medical technology for premature or sick children, because you could keep a baby alive a lot better in an incubator than you could just in a blanket. Also, cabbages were associated with fertility in medieval Europe, and modern medical science does back up that cabbages are actually very good for pregnant women because they have a lot of nutrients that help with pregnancy. And then, of course, there's the argument he makes that playing pin the tail on the donkey is a Masonic initiation ritual. It's not at all. Also, you can't become a Mason until you're 18 or 21 in most places. And by that I mean that most places it's 21, some it's 18. And also, we have Demolay. There's an entire group, an organized group for the children of Masons to kind of get them into Freemasonry as children. It's like Boy Scouts. So why would we need pin the tail on the donkey when we have an actual thing for it? I would also address his claims that the Civil War was made up, but we already explained why the doctored photos exist, and that's his main argument. And also, I have my great-great-great-grandfather's conscription papers from the war. So unless you're gonna accuse me of faking them. He then goes on to talk about empty cities in these photos and just dismisses the entire long exposure time argument without actually addressing it, just says it doesn't matter. Also, about half a dozen of the examples he gives on screen have people, carriages, things in them, just not many. It's also important to note that we don't know what time of day these photos were taken, and it is possible that somebody just got up really early to go take pictures before the city was bustling. In fact, if your goal was to capture a cityscape with as few people as possible so you could see the streets and everything, it would make sense that you would get up at the crack of dawn to do it. And then he also shows a bunch of cities and says, like, in this year, usually a decade or two earlier, this city only had a few thousand people, so why are there so many buildings only 10 years later? But most of the pictures he's showing are gold rush cities during the gold rush, so of course they grew rapidly. People found out there was gold there, people moved, and they had to build cities around the people. And then finally, we come to the most famous argument about Tartaria, in my opinion, which is the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. The classic claim is that the buildings we see in pictures of the World's Fair were already there and that they were torn down afterwards to hide Tartaria. Which again begs the question, when did the Tartarians disappear? When is all of this supposed to have happened? Because 1893 isn't that long ago. Once again, I will point out that we didn't tear down all the other examples of Tartarian architecture that he used throughout his video, and they didn't even tear down the museum that they built. So if the Tartarians built the entire White City, and we took down the entire White City to hide the Tartarians, why did we leave one of the buildings standing? In fact, why did we put extra effort into making sure that building was actually made out of stone and not just wood coated in plaster to look like masonry? Mind Unveiled snidely asks us, these architectures seen in these photos of the World's Fair in America during the early 1900s, it was the 1800s, the late 1800s actually, there were a few in the early 1900s, but the majority of them were in the late 1800s, were all just built in a short 2 to 3 year span with no construction photos, and that they were all built from wooden pallets? My friends, there are construction photos. There's a lot of construction photos. I don't know where the argument that there's no construction photos is coming from. And it's not like they're hard to find. You just Google 1893 World's Fair construction photos, and they're there. And I know Mind Unveiled doesn't do his research, because he couldn't even figure out whether or not I was a real Freemason, despite the fact that I do in fact show up in the fall issue of the Pennsylvania Freemason from last year. That's from the response video. Although he then goes on to say, or at least not a real Freemason, like, a Scottish Rite, and I'm like, dude, most of my lodge is Scottish Rite Masons. And also, it's not like a difficult thing to do. You just find out when a 4th degree ceremony is happening, and then you pay like $20 and you go. The only requirement to getting into the Scottish Rite is being a 3rd degree Mason. But yeah, my point about the World's Fair issue, there are photos. His entire argument is there's not photos. Discussion over. Now, I do have some observations to make very quickly, which are basically all of Mind Unveiled's evidence that he gives. Every picture, everything he says there's no construction photos of, there's no record of it, I was able, usually within minutes, to find evidence. Why is it that basically everything he says turns out to be entirely explainable, and yet he claims he's doing all this research? Related to that, why do mainstream historians require photographic evidence, documents, archaeological proof, all these different pieces for us to be believed, but we can just take Sarian Donnelly and McDerry at their word. Now, I could go through literally every point made by Donnelly, McDerry, and Sarian, and I could find evidence of every building they say there's no construction photos or record of, and I could find manuscripts for every allegedly forged document. But that would take weeks. So instead of doing that, and confident in the fact that this video has provided enough evidence to show that, at the very least, Mind Unveiled isn't doing his research, I'm gonna put it here. Tartaria, at least this version, has been undone. But just on the off chance that I haven't made my point, don't mind the meat stick. On the off chance I haven't made, I'm hungry. On the off chance I haven't made my point, next week, we're giving you something very special. You see, we have a new show called History Unhinged. We do it with Stephen Bell from Stakuyi, History of Everything, those channels. And being historians, I thought it would be funny if during a shoot for History Unhinged, a shoot week, if we sat him down and we exposed him to Mind Unused. And so we did. And I would say he's traumatized, personally. I don't think he'll ever be the same again. It's... How would you describe the way he responded to Mind Unused? Mind abused?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Mind altered.
Yeah, he didn't take it well. So next week you'll be getting, how long is it? Like an hour and a half?
If not close to 2 hours.
Hour and a half to 2 hours of us mentally flashbanging Steven with the Tartaria theory. He didn't know anything about it. And we showed him the entire video that this was responding to. All at once, one day, sat him down, strapped him to a chair, put little handcuffs on his... Never mind. We plied him with meat sticks and liquor, and the result was beautiful. Speaking of the meat sticks, if Pearson Ranch wants to sponsor us, please do. I like your meat in my mouth. But with all of that said, and I certainly did say a lot in this episode, if you want to support what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can do so most directly by going to patreon.com and signing up for a subscription. Those tiers start at just $1, and they'll get you access to some exclusive content. We just shot another Drunk Folklore, Liquored Lore as we call it, with Steven. We also played a 2-hour game of Cards Against Humanity, which has a very special little moment at the end, and you'll get to see that all for just $1, which is cheaper than a lot of other subscriptions you can pay for on the internet. It's got men, it's got meat sticks, it's also got women. Yeah, there's girls in it. So, anyway, if you would like to support us in less direct but more fashionable ways, you can go to bunkerbranding.com and get any of our merch. It's soft, it's nice, it looks good, it's made in the United States, and more importantly, when you're out on the street wearing it, my mom might come up to you and say, "Hi, that's my son," which is a real thing that happened last week. If you are the guy who my mom approached last week, by the way, wouldn't be last week at the time this video is coming out, but if you're the guy my mom approached, please send us an email at thelorelodge@gmail.com. I would like to send you some more merch for handling that so well. I will likely ask you to prove that it was you, so I'll make sure that's doable, but if it wasn't you, don't be that guy. But if you are that guy, be that guy. But if you would prefer to drink the lodge rather than wear the lodge, you can do so by going to tableauroastingco.com and purchasing Mount Pocono Perk. And remember how I mentioned Stephen Bell? He has one too. It is called Lewis and Dark. Speaking of Lewis and Dark, we're also going to be covering the alleged murder of Meriwether Lewis in a video coming up soon, so be on the lookout for that. I'm very excited. But that's what's coming up for the Lore Lodge. If you need more Lodge, and you need it now, then you can get it by going to History Unhinged, you can get it by going to the Weird Bible, or to my personal channel, Aiden Mattis, where I mostly stream video games in which I get frustrated with my friends for being bad at them. If you want to make sure you have all the updates for when these things are coming out, the best way to do that is through our Discord. The link is in the description, or you can go to bit.ly/jointhelodge. And I think that's just about it, right? Also, something you'll be notified on Discord of is our live show, The Lore Lads, and we just shot an episode of that with our mayor. I'm not kidding. The mayor of this town. He was right there, and we said things to him. We explained some of the lore of the Backyardigans to our mayor. And we also read from the Message translation of the Bible in a Donald Trump impersonation. It worked a little too well. And last but not least, thank you to Delete Me for sponsoring this video. I hope you guys appreciated the content. All right. With all that said, I'm Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.